into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
50 years ago, 8 Americans set off for South America to climb Aconcagua, one of the world's mightiest mountains. Things quickly went wrong. 2 climbers died. Their bodies were left behind. Now, a camera belonging to one of the deceased climbers has emerged from a receding glacier near the summit. And one of mountaineering's most enduring mysteries has been given air and light. And so the question is, has it been given enough air and light to solve this mystery? It's a 50-year mystery, right? So as you can see, I'm citing this excellent long-form article from the New York Times. By the way, hello everyone. I know I'm a little bit early. I know this is going to be quite a long analysis. I want to try and get this done before midnight my time so I can get a proper sleep at the proper time. If you want to read this article, you can check it out at this link. I have put the link in the description as well. To some extent, the analysis here is derivative from this article, but I wouldn't say it's entirely derived from it. It's a story by John Branch, written December 9, 2023, called Ghosts on the Glacier. Okay, and the image behind me is Aconcagua. There you can see it. Well, it's the highest mountain behind me. I've climbed Kilimanjaro, which is the highest mountain in Africa. It's still about a kilometer, that's about 1,000 meters, a little bit less than that, lower than Aconcagua. So the degree of difficulty is significantly harder on Aconcagua. Stephanie, good to see you. Sharon, all of you guys, good to see you. So I'll be sharing a little bit of my experience at particular altitudes, and then I'll kind of let you in on what I think about Aconcagua. And I have to say, reading this article has affected my enthusiasm. You'll find out in which direction to climb Aconcagua. Just to give you a good idea, Aconcagua is the highest mountain in the world, in the Western Hemisphere, in the entire Western Hemisphere. So it's the highest mountain in North and South America, and also the highest mountain in the Southern Hemisphere. So if you take the Western and Southern Hemispheres, that's essentially 3/4 in a way of the planet, right? And it's only the Eastern Hemisphere, that little quadrant of the Himalayas, that has got higher mountains than this particular mountain. So it is quite a extraordinarily high mountain. It's not just the highest mountain in South America, it's the highest mountain in the entire Americas. It's the higher mountain than the highest mountain in Africa, and the highest mountain in Antarctica and Australia. Not that Australia's got very high mountains. So it is quite a significant, I mean, this article refers to it as a mighty mountain, and in a way it kind of is. But the question we want to ask here is, in a 50-year-old expedition, there were 8 Americans on it. 2 of them didn't come back, and they had significant injuries, and that's really where you want to start with the autopsies, and there were autopsies done. Do these injuries look like typical injuries falling, of someone falling, or in other words, typical kind of blunt force type injuries? Or do they look like something else? So to some extent, it's the forte of true crime. On the other hand, and so we might also deal with things like, who were the people, what were the team dynamics, what were the identities of the victims? Could there have been any weird feelings towards them? And that is quite an interesting rabbit hole to go down, because there is something to talk about there. And then who could have done this and what would the motive have been? That's the other thing. But then comparing that to the likelihood that they could simply have died on the mountain. Bear in mind, if someone wants to kill you on a mountain, one way to do it is simply not to help you. You don't have to like literally kill someone. You can just not help them or leave them there, right? So anyway, we're going to be venturing into somewhat unknown territory. Sally Vella says, Happy New Year. Hit the like button. Yep, that's right. Anyway, good to see you guys here. Let's get started. So you're an investigator tasked with figuring out what happened, right? It's your job to you're hired by perhaps the victim's family, and you have got to find out what happened here. Where do you start, right? What you know is there was an expedition. You know 2 people died. You are given the responsibility in terms of one of those victims. Do you look at what happened to the other victim, or just what happened to the victim whose family is paying you to find out? But basically, where do you start? What do you guys say? Hi, Sharon. Hi, Swedish Mom. Hi, Leslie. Good to see everyone here. Chelsea, good to see you. Okay, where do you start? Well, with woods and trees. That's quite an important way to think about it. Think about it in terms of the minutiae, the details, and then also the bigger picture. In other words, like what is the character of this mountain? What are the broad statistics on this mountain? And what happened in 1973, 50 years ago? Does that kind of match the average, right? So that's something else you want to look at. As I said earlier, what sort of injuries, the timeline, and then what you want to do is move from trees to woods and woods to trees. Ask questions like, who are these people? What were their relationships? What was their status? Who were they back home, and what did they bring to the mountain? Did they bring feelings of resentment? Did they bring feelings of superiority? Did they bring feelings of hubris? Who were the celebrities on this trip? And there were a couple, and who perhaps didn't really appreciate that. And if you guys, I think some of you have read my books on Everest, the 96 Everest disaster, you knew that the presence of journalists on board, almost like in the movie Aliens, is there an alien on board? And it's like, yeah, well, there's one all the way. It's the same thing. The presence of a journalist on board some of these expeditions was kind of, I don't want to say toxic or poisonous, but it kind of created a additional tension and an additional pressure, both in terms of the leadership and the folks that were, I guess, the stars of the show, right? And it definitely had an impact on the ordinary climber, the fact that there was a media attention. And so once again in this story, there is media attention. Not really a journalist on board, but the media were paying attention for a couple of reasons. One was that there's a woman, American woman that was climbing, which was quite rare and unusual in 1973. And the other thing is that she, as a woman, as a person, she was quite an unusual person in and of herself. Some might say she was an acquired taste, right? Phil, good to see you here. Okay, so we want to ask, who are these people? What were their relationships with one another in terms of the expedition? What is the timeline of this? Did the events happen high up on the mountain when you'd think the mountain is at its most powerful and the mountain would be the most likely candidate? Or did it happen on the way down, which is often when things happen? So we want to address and ask and answer all of those questions. But one of the central questions, if you go to the if you get to the point where you say, I think this is foul play, well, then you've got a very difficult question to answer. If it was a crime, what is the motive? Now, obviously, if the mountain kills these climbers, then you don't need to ask that question. You don't need to ask why or even how. It's kind of quite obvious. They were high on a dangerous mountain. By the way, Aconcagua means, let me just see if I can find it. I don't know, it depends on which, what's the word? I guess tribe in a way. The etymology is, it may come from Aconcagua, which refers to the Aconcagua River, which means comes from the other side. Some call it Sentinel of Stone, some call it White Sentinel. But there are others who refer to it as the Mountain of Death. The Mountain of Death. And is that because there's a serial killer on the mountain, or is that because a lot of people die on the mountain? We're going to deal with these statistics, but I can tell you now, I think up to the present, something like 153 people have died on Aconcagua, which is not really that much compared to Everest. Let's have a look at Everest figures. Death toll on Everest. Any ideas? 330 people. So at least twice as many people have died trying to climb Everest. I must say those numbers are actually lower than I would have thought. But, Everest is a much more popular mountain, more prestigious mountain as well. Stephanie says even the trek to base camp is a lot. Okay, so let's get going. So I'm going to deal with some extracts, some excerpts from this article, starting with this one. Colombero's memory holds one other striking detail, a rock sitting on top of Johnson. Her body was in a field of ice. So I'm just sharing with you why people felt this was suspicious. One of the reasons was they found one of the victims with a rock on her, I guess, on her torso. Colombero said that he was too young and inexperienced to draw conclusions, but the older men were sure Johnson was murdered. And I think that's quite an interesting setup, is the younger guys like, I don't know what happened here. There's a woman lying there, she's got a rock on her chest, but the others are saying she was definitely murdered. So imagine this, you are walking through a field and you see a woman on the ground and she's got a rock on her chest. Does that mean she was murdered? Now, you would say, well, in a field, how could the rock have gotten there? But in a mountain setting, is it possible that a rock could have gotten there naturally? Is it possible? Then the next question is it probable, right? And then you've also got to bear in mind where she was found. She was found in a field of ice, right? And what does that mean? Was she found, where there's glaciers, and were those glaciers melting? And do you typically get rocks in glaciers? Anyway, Colin Barrows said they thought everything was planned, that it wasn't an accident, that someone had hit her and tried to make it look like she rolled down the hill in exhaustion. Now, if you ask me, if someone had tried to make it look like an accident, you wouldn't leave the rock on her, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Their discovery and version of events was soon highlighted in the Mendoza newspapers, along with gruesome photos they took. Johnson's body was just 20 meters from where Cooper's body had lain. And I'll introduce these two individuals to you in a moment. I just want to kind of let you know what the locals were thinking. What's the next section here? Is it this one? Okay, so let's just read this bottom part. The The three men were unprepared to bring Johnson's body down, so they dug it out, shifted it so that a future recovery expedition would see it. They found a ring with a cloudy brown stone on Johnson's finger. They removed it and passed it to an American climber named Alan Steck, who happened to be on the mountain at the same time. In April 1975, in other words, about 2 years later, he sent it to Abrahamson, Johnson's sister, and we're going to be dealing with her in a little bit more detail. Now, the same kind of protocols and rules and issues, if you're going to deal with this with a true crime perspective, apply over here, which is, was the crime scene contaminated? Has the body been altered by, like normally you talk about, was there a cover up, right? Was there someone interfering with the crime scene, making it look different? And yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. The cover up is done by nature. The contamination of the crime scene is done by the elements. And so if you're going to do things like DNA and fiber, well, none of that's really going to take you anywhere. It's very unlikely that you're going to get anywhere by using any of those typical, what do you call it, almost like 5-star tools in the true crime arsenal, because the amount of, destruction of the bodies is quite immense. And the other thing is, the other thing that is in favor is, to some extent, the preservation of the body, because it's been frozen. So when you find the human remains, they're actually frozen and they are kind of rigid. So it's like literally taking down an ice block down the mountain. And what's at least good about that is the injuries are at least to some extent preserved. So you might not have things like fiber or DNA or hair or things like that, but you will have to some extent the exact injury preserved. So in other words, you won't have the issue of the body drying out, the body decomposing completely, and just being left with a skeleton. So there is a little bit of an advantage to the mountain setting. Okay, so let's continue. I think I might need to turn my phone off. So this is the ring that was recovered, and that kind of gives you a sense of reality, that this used to belong to a person, and this person used to live in, I think, Colorado. And this is Janet Johnson's ring. And they found it on her, they recovered it from her, and they gave it to her sister. And that is her sister's hand holding her ring. So there you have it. In February 1976, William Montalbano, the Latin America correspondent for the Miami Herald, wrote 2 articles about the deadly mysteries of Aconcagua. So basically, 3 years went by, 2 to 3 years went by, and then someone wrote an article, and this article kind of led to a lot of conspiracy theories, rumors, speculation, right? And so the second article he wrote focused on the recovery of Johnson's body. And so you had a headline saying, let's do it full screen. The headline read, "How did Janet Johnson really die?" Right? And I must say, this is a bit of a spoiler alert. The death of John Cooper, the NASA scientist, feels kind of normal. It feels like there's not too much to see there. So a little bit of a spoiler alert there. The death of Janet Johnson, the death of the only woman on the expedition, seems a little more troublesome. And some of the witness statements around that are very weird, right? And so that's already putting you in a position where you are split to some extent in your thinking. You're either going to think if one of these victims died naturally, then doesn't it mean that the other victim died naturally, right? Or did the one die naturally and then that person was now out the way and the men in the remainder of the expedition there wasn't really a witness besides the two men themselves. And we're going to deal with those two characters in due course. So let's just have a look at what he writes here. There is sufficient mystery and enough unanswered questions surrounding the death of Janet Johnson and NASA engineer John Cooper on the same 1973 expedition to have raised the suspicion of foul play. The article focused on Ramon Arrieta Cortez, the lead investigator, who must establish did Aconcagua kill Janet Johnson? Did the mountain kill her, or was she murdered? Soon after, a team of men, mostly police officers in Mendoza with climbing experience, found Johnson's body. Her face was darker, far more mummified than a year earlier. You must bear in mind, this is not just someone who is lying in a crime scene for an hour or half a day or 1 day or 2 days, or even a week or a month. It's 1 year and then another year, right? That's a really long time. They use the word mummified to describe her appearance. There's exposure not just to the sun, but also to the wind. The men struggled to extricate Johnson from the ice. They crudely sliced her left arm at the shoulder and left it with a broken watch still on her wrist. So in a weird way, she's almost cemented to this ice. And it's very hard to actually get her out of that situation. So I think that's kind of another good point to pause on is, what did we just deal with now? Was someone speculating that she wasn't found, she was found kind of, let's just go back to that point. I don't want to put words in their mouths. What did they say? Someone had hit her and tried to make it look like she rolled down the hill in exhaustion. Now, I don't know, when I read that, it makes me think, oh, so she was found kind of on the ground. She was found, to say down the hill makes it sound like, okay, so she was kind of in the foothills, and we're going to deal with where she was lying. But the question really is, if she's still cemented to the ice, then where is she? Well, doesn't that mean she's kind of in the glacial part? And then doesn't it mean that the rock that is on her chest kind of makes sense because glaciers carry rocks, right? Anyway, let's continue. Then he says, we had to dig the ice to get her unfrozen from the glacier. So there's just confirmation that she's found on a glacier. And he said it was like taking a piece of the glacier off the mountain. So let me ask you a question. If Janet Johnson was found on a glacier, would you say she was found near the bottom of the mountain or near the top of the mountain? I know it's a little bit of we don't know the mountain too well. If you just look just above the peak of my head, that's Aconcagua, right? We don't know the mountain very well. That's one of the things we need to deal with. We need to deal with the woods. What does this mountain look like? What is its temperament? What is the route up the mountain? What do climbers have to deal with, right? So these are really important things we need to look at. But the question is basically, so Janet was found on or in partially cemented to a glacier. Does that mean she was, just by inference, does that mean she was probably lower on the mountain or higher on the mountain? So let me type it in here. If Janet was found on, what's happened now? Comments. If Janet was found on a glacier, does that mean she was higher or lower on the mountain? That's the question. Are you guys getting ads? So this is kind of what I'm getting at. If she's still frozen to the mountain, then can she be very far down the mountain? That's basically it, right? If she's frozen to the mountain, then is she higher on the mountain or lower? And I think it's kind of obvious that she's got to be very high, right? Very high. That's the right answer. You're excused if you get it wrong, because we haven't really looked at the mountain or where the glacier is. But if you just think of it in a common sense way, is ice going to remain permanently iced year round, higher up or lower down, right? And the answer is, well, it would tend to be higher up, especially in this time of receding glaciers. Okay. Right, so let's continue. So I'm referring here and there to excerpts from this amazing article. We are going to deviate from the article here and there, but look at what this guy says. You could see the bone. The men who found Johnson's body and witnessed her autopsy believe she was murdered. Now, you'd think that's quite compelling evidence, right? In other words, those who were there when the autopsy was performed, who saw the injuries, felt, well, this looks like murder, right? So we're going to briefly deal with Cooper's injuries, and then we're going to deal with who these individuals were, a little bit of the backstory, their teammates, the what do you call it, the team spirit, how good was that, what was going on with that, was there anyone arguing, was there anyone who was creating problems, right? So he still remembers Cooper because of the skull fracture, and especially the tubular hole to his abdomen. It was like a bullet hole, perfectly round. The wound was so deep that it reached all the way to Cooper's spine. Araujo always suspected an ice screw. So when you look at that, you kind of got to ask yourself, does that seem like, let's call it natural injuries, kind of blunt force type injuries from a fall, climbers falling down a mountain, or does that seem strange? Johnson's autopsy stands out because of the damage to her face, right? So that is Johnson's autopsy. So Cooper doesn't have face damage, he just has a skull fracture, but Johnson has a lot more damage to her face. Bone is exposed in 3 places. Araujo recalled deep cuts on her boot that made him think someone had taken some hard wax at her. So if you think now about damage to her face, was the damage to her face caused by a murderer, by falling down the mountain, or simply by the weather moving over her face for about 2 years? Johnson's autopsy report with photos was submitted to a judge. Like Cooper, she officially died of contusion cranioencephalica, a brain injury. So both of them died of brain injuries. And I think one can speculate and say when climbers fall off mountains, typically, do they die of broken necks, brain injuries? What actually kills someone who falls off a mountain? I just want to see if I can get a stat for that. Most common, I know what it's going to say. It's going to say edema, which is basically a brain injury or lung injury from internal hemorrhage. That's not really what, I don't know if that's what he's referring to. Most common high mountain injuries. Let's see what they are. All right, and then juries. No, injuries. Okay. Okay, so this is hikers and mountain climbers. That's not quite what I'm looking for. Ligament sprains, muscle strains. No, that's not what we're looking for. Most common high mountain injuries, most common injuries in fatal injuries, most common high mountain. Causing death. Not sure if we're going to find this very easily. What is the most common cause of death in the wilderness? What is the mortality rate for mountaineers? Okay, I can't really get what I'm looking for, but I think you can see where I'm going. In other words, what I'm trying to find out is a brain injury an unusual injury on a mountain? Robbie Robbins says head injury. Now, bear in mind, you can get two kinds of brain injuries on a mountain. The one is where you fall and you hit your head, and the other one is where the altitude basically starts causing your brain to bleed, right? I think hypothermia is common, but it's in a way an aggravating thing. So it's something that leads to things getting worse. So we're going to deal with, it's not like Johnson and Cooper just died just like that. They started to struggle. And I think that's another question where you've got to say, were they murdered, or was the mountain the murderer? Iceland, good to see you. Paul says, yes, the brain can swell with altitude. That's true. So you can get pulmonary edema, which is blood and fluid in the lungs, and you can get cerebral edema, which is bleeding of the brain, right? Okay, so let's have a look at this. So what's quite interesting here is they're thinking about, they say these kinds of injuries were not self-inflicted. So that was another thing they were considering. Did these climbers who were in distress, were the injuries self-inflicted? And then the consensus of the examiners in the room, of those, witnessing the autopsy, was that yes, they were killed, no doubt about it. And so we are here as true crime experts, and we had to use our expertise and see, is there any doubt? Was this murder? Was this foul play? Or is it uncertain? Okay. So let's go on to the next thing. So again, where do we begin? Well, we begin with all of the obvious questions. What are the obvious questions? Well, they're the most basic questions. They're these questions, right? Who, what, where, when, how, and why, right? Who are the victims? Who are the other climbers? What mountain are we talking about? What was the altitude? Where exactly on the mountain did this take place? When did things basically go wrong? For how long did things go wrong? When someone was in trouble, did someone else try and help? How did that go? How did the person apparently die? and then I guess why did they die, right? Joe Huck says, I don't know this case. Interesting. So this is an article from around the time. It's dated February 4th, February 1973, right? And this shows you the route that they took up the mountain, and it shows you the victims. Let's get that out the way and me out the way. So they're the victims: John Cooper, an engineer, basically a NASA scientist, and Janet Johnson. She was the only woman on the expedition, and she's I think a teacher from Boulder, Colorado. And yeah, you see something about the experience. Her experience, she climbed Kilimanjaro, Mont Blanc, Fujiyama, the Matterhorn, quite a lot of experience. Okay, so this is so it was quite a big deal, a big enough deal that it even made the local news. Quite a big story in the local news, right? So we're going to deal with Cooper first of all. We're going to deal with the male member that died. We're going to find out who he was, what kind of person he was, how much experience he has. And by the way, if you're running an expedition, then you want to know these things as well. You want to know someone's temperament. You want to know, works well with others. You want to know that they have a certain amount of fitness. And even if you feel that they, even if they are not very strong climbers, you need to know that so that you know how much you need to kind of babysit them. So you're going to need to know either way what level of independence each client is going to bring to the table, or lack of, right? And so the question is, was a NASA engineer the kind of guy that you would need to hold his hand? So before we even get to know him, what do you think the answer is? Did John Cooper need hand holding? Right? In other words, was he someone who'd been in this kind of situation before? He had the experience, he knew what he was doing, etc., right? And you can ask the same question of Janet Johnson. Was she someone who needed hand holding? Was she someone who was struggling? Was she someone who needed assistance, right? And so that's a really important thing to determine before someone climbs. And in terms of an investigation, that's something you want to determine as well. And bear in mind, a lot of climbers hide this away. They try and conceal their weakness, and of course the mountain exposes it. So obviously I'm asking you guys without the benefit of, I guess many of you don't know, haven't read the article, but it does make sense. While a NASA engineer is probably not a fool, he probably has some common sense, right? But then another question arises: does NASA expertise, does knowing about space, is that helpful in the mountains? Right? So just if you take his job, is that going to help him? Bear in mind, he's not an astronaut. Is that going to help him in this kind of environment, right? So let's have a look at these, at the team. So on the left there, Miguel Alfonso, 38 years old, mountain guide. Carmi Defoe, 52, lawyer. As far as I know, he was the either the lead or the deputy leader, this guy. He's a lawyer. Jim Petrosky, 39, psychiatrist. He was between these two, they were the kind of the leaders. It could be Defoe was the leader and Petrosky was the deputy leader, or the other way around. Kami is the oldest person on board, 52 years old. Then there's Bill Eubank, a physician, another word for a doctor. And then you've got Arnold McMillan, 46 years old. He's a dairy farmer. Now, can you see there's quite a difference here? Lawyer, psychiatrist, physician, dairy farmer, right? In terms of status, in terms of, how can one put it? Yeah, I guess status is the best way to put it. You've got lawyer, psychiatrist, physician, dairy farmer. And that's the status in the city. What do you think the status was on the mountain? Of these three individuals, of these four individuals here, which one of them got to, I'm not actually sure if he summited, but he got very near the top. Which one do you think it is? The leader or the deputy leader, the physician or the dairy farmer? Okay, and then in the next line, Bill Zeller, police officer. And then there's a college student. He's the youngest person on board, John Shelton. There's John Cooper, 35 years old. And then Janet Johnson, 36 years old, a teacher. Interestingly, they also of a similar age, 35, 36. Is that a factor in the mechanics of this? So you've got some fairly mature climbers here, 52 years old. And then you've got climbers half as old, 25 years old, right? And then you've got the victims right in the middle, 35. So you've got two climbers, you have 25, you've got a couple in their mid-30s, and then you've got climbers that are a bit older, late 40s and 50. And if you just close your eyes and you say, okay, just based on the ages of these climbers, do you think that they were a cohesive group? If you didn't know anything about this case, and you said, just based on the ages of these climbers, do you think that they went up as a sort of a, what's the word? A group that stuck together and that cared about one another and that could, what's the word? Relate to one another, right? Do you think a 25-year-old relates a lot to a 52-year-old? Do you think a 35-year-old relates very well to a 25-year-old? Maybe. How about to a 45-year-old, right? And then the real question is, how well are these people relating to one another on a mountain? Because the other question is the abilities of a 25-year-old compared to a 52-year-old, right? Endurance, strength, patience, all those kind of things. Do you think that is going to be consistent from expedition member 1 all the way up to 8, right? And then if you take the age thing and you push that aside, and you say, okay, what about the kind of jobs these people come from? You know, if this was an episode of Survivor, which tribes would form in and of themselves? Well, you can see there are some fairly prestigious folk. There's psychiatrist, a lawyer, physician, and then there's some fairly ordinary people. There's a college student, there's a teacher. I was a teacher once upon a time. There's a police officer. And so you can see there's quite a variety of backgrounds that are here. And so the question is, the combination of different ages and different backgrounds, is that going to lead to the kind of like a team spirit? What do you think? That's good to hear. Good to see you here, Iceland. Stephanie says they probably developed their own groups within the group. And then you can say, would that lead to murder? And I think you would say, well, without that happening, wonderful, warm and fuzzy team spirit, is murder going to be likely? On the other hand, if the group is splintering, is that going to more likely give the mountain its opportunity to fracture the group and claim a victim, right? It's quite a difficult question because in both senses, the likelihood of casualty goes up. So in a proper team, you can't imagine a murder taking place, but by the same token, you can't imagine someone allowing someone else to get into trouble. But in a situation where there's no team spirit, you could have both. You could have a murder in a sense, and you could also have the mountain finding someone vulnerable, right? That's right. Kate says you still are a teacher. Okay, so these are the members, right? And these are the two victims here, John Cooper and Janet Johnson. And you can't say, well, John was too old or he was too young. And you can't say that about Janet either, right? You can't say that they were very, very young, they were very inexperienced, well, there was someone younger than them. You can't say that they were very old because there was someone older than them. So I don't think you can, if you want to blame something, I don't think you can blame age unless you say that at 35 someone can be very motivated, right? Barbara Collins, good to see you here. Run the World says, everyone we met on our trip were doctors and lawyers. That's interesting. So we've got someone here who actually went to South America, and you were kind of in the area, right, of the mountain. Kate says a lawyer could offer legal advice. Okay, so let's continue. So Cooper arguably was the biggest big shot of them all. So if you look at this, let's take myself away. If you look at this and you had to say, of these individuals here, there's a mountain guide, there's a lawyer, there's a psychiatrist, there's a physician, dairy farmer, police officer, college student, NASA engineer, teacher, base camp manager, and you had to say, let's pick one of these guys. And like, I'm a news reporter and I want to make a big deal out of this group. Which guy would you be like, wow, can you believe it? This guy is also part of this group. Which one would be the big shot? Which one would stand head and shoulders above the others as a kind of big shot in this group, right? And I think the answer is the NASA engineer, right? The NASA engineer. And you must also think about it in terms of the folks on this expedition. Hi, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm still a college student. Oh, and you? Well, I'm a NASA engineer. Okay, wow. Hi, what do you do? Well, I'm a farmer. Oh, okay. And you? Well, I work for NASA. Oh, okay. So it's not just the perception of someone being a big shot. It's also the person himself saying, when he looks in the mirror, well, I'm probably the biggest big shot on this expedition. It doesn't mean he's going to impose it on others, but there's nevertheless possibly going to be a bit of a status quo developing. And also, again, how are the media going to be treating some of the people here compared to others, right? Bear in mind, there's a doctor on board, right? How they're going to be treating the doctor compared to the teacher, or the doctor compared to the police officer, or the doctor compared to the college student, right? So you can see there's definitely, in a status sense, a bit of a schism. Okay, so let's go back to the article. And yeah, we have it. Just do that. American newspapers sent them off, and Argentine newspapers greeted them at the Nutibara Hotel in Mendoza's city center. So what that's really telling you is when they left America, it was a big deal. And that's why you've got this photo of them right? You got them this photo of them boarding the plane, and they're in all the newspapers, right? When they leave America and when they arrive on the other side, there are local reporters that are like, wow, 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 what's going on here? So Rafael Moran, a reporter for Los Andes, a daily newspaper in Mendoza, interviewed the mountaineers near the pool. He did not cover every Aconcagua expedition. So it wasn't like everyone who gets off the plane, okay, who are you? He only covered certain expeditions if he felt it was a big deal. And he said this one was especially intriguing. There were Americans, there was the Polish glacier, and I'll speak to you about that in a moment, a woman, and a NASA scientist, kind of in that order. It's a bunch of Americans coming to climb our mountain. Wow, 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 wow. Oh, and they're not climbing the normal route, they're climbing the much harder Polish glacier route. And that's also very significant here. You're climbing a hard mountain, but you're not climbing it the easiest way. And all these now the experience of these climbers becomes even more crucial, right? They're going up a more difficult way up a particular glacier where it's quite difficult. You walk kind of through these ice needles. I guess it's the Aconcagua equivalent of the Kumbu icefall. It's a very dangerous, tricky, exhausting strait that the climbers trying to get up Everest have got to go through, right? So the Kumbu icefall on Aconcagua is basically, I guess, the Polish glacier. And look at how this is mentioned in this report. Basically, that the woman, an American woman, is almost seen as more wow than the NASA scientist. And then you've also got to think, how do the other climbers feel about this woman getting all the attention? Remember, this is 1973. How do all the men on this expedition feel about a woman getting all this attention? And they might feel, wow, I actually like her. She's actually quite pretty, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they like her, but what if they don't like her? And then what about the NASA scientist that basically you could imagine thinks, hey, 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 I'm the big shot here. And maybe he feels like there's a competition between me and her. Or maybe she feels like there's a competition between me and him. And isn't it ironic that the two standout figures on this expedition, and there she is over there, would you have recognized her if I didn't point her out to you? That's Janet Johnson over there. And at the other end of the line at the top, that is John Cooper. And they're the victims in this. The two kind of stars of the media show end up being the victims on this. And I suppose you could argue it two ways. You could say there was resentment from their teammates, and that's the motive. Or you could say, yeah, well, there would be resentment anyway, and that certainly didn't help the team cohesion, and the mountain did the rest, right? Or you could say, what is the other one? Did the one resent the other, right? Did Johnson resent Cooper, and Cooper resented Johnson, and that actually created a lot of kind of drama for the rest of the team. Like their egos basically caused all the problems. And then there's the third possibility, which I think is quite sensible, not sensible, but obvious, which is if a big fuss is being made of you even before you get to the mountain, your name is in newspapers, right? Are you going to try a little bit harder to get to the top of the mountain? In other words, your name is in lights, and your wife and relatives are saying, wow, we saw you in the newspaper. How's the climb going? Are you going to be trying harder and pushing harder than someone else whose name isn't in there? In other words, is the pressure on you going to be greater? Barbara Collins says, this is so educational. That's good to hear. Melsila says, not murder, but competition. So in other words, you must think about the idea that the person who's driving themselves perhaps into the greatest danger isn't the expedition leader, isn't the mountain, it's the individual. It's like, you shouldn't really be doing this, but well, I can't, how can I go home and say I didn't get to the top of the mountain? I'm already kind of famous for going to the mountain. I'm gonna swallow hard. It's gonna be a bitter pill to swallow if I were to come back and say, yeah, I actually I couldn't make it. I was too weak. I was too tired. Right? I have to do this, right? Okay, so the New York Times provides some meaty background on both Cooper and Johnson. I think in the chronology of the article, I think they deal with Johnson first. I'm going to deal with Cooper first. Okay, so the question now is, does Johnson think he's a big shot? Do other people think he's a big shot? Is he a big shot? Well, let's look at his background. Just a month before, in December 1972, so in other words, just a month before he went to climb the mountain, John Cooper was at Mission Control in Houston for the 17th and final Apollo mission, wearing a black mustache and a headset, communicating with astronauts on the moon. Whoa, let's just stop right there. So let's just, we need to go back in time. This is 1972. And this guy's part of NASA in 1972. And so what is he doing in 1972? Well, he's literally dealing with the moon missions. He's having conversations with astronauts on the moon. And so if you were anybody in that time, wouldn't you think, wow, you are quite a lucky guy. You are quite an important guy. It also says here that Cooper was a surface operations engineer helping guide the lunar module, right? So he's not just a NASA engineer. He's like part of NASA's big moment in history, right? In one of the biggest moments in human history. Some people believe it didn't even happen. Cooper also wore his new mountain climbing boots to work, to break them in for what he anticipated would be a difficult expedition to Aconcagua. So we're going to jump out of that for a moment. Now, let me ask you a question. If you're a NASA scientist and you've been kind of dealing with all of this moon activity, do you think you're going to be leaving the office to go and hike and climb mountains? Like, if your job is to be, you're a very important dude at NASA and your job is to manage these missions, do you think you're going to be finding time to quickly head to Africa and climb Kilimanjaro and quickly, do you think you're going to be doing that? Chelsea says probably not. I don't think so. I think you're going to be like, you know what, Aconcagua is not a very high mountain, and I thought the same myself. Kilimanjaro is quite high. Aconcagua is a little bit higher. It's not really going to be that difficult, right? And who cares if we go the less easy route? It's not going to be really difficult. That's very well said. He would have been an academic. And so that's exactly it. So he's coming in there as a big shot off the mountain. And now on the mountain, is he such a big shot? So here's some more background. Cooper grew up in El Dorado, Kansas, with a love of the outdoors. He went to Oklahoma University to get a degree in geological engineering, but the flat oil fields where his father worked were not for him. He spent college summers working for the Forest Service and then as a smoke jumper in the American West. Did you see anything there about someone who has climbed high mountains? he got a degree in geological engineering. Well, that's not, you might know the geology of the mountain. Does that mean you know how to climb a mountain? Then later in the US Coast Guard, he became a pilot and he won awards for rescues off the coast of Florida and in the Caribbean. He learned to deep sea dive. So if you can fly a helicopter and you can swim in the sea, does that mean you can climb a high mountain? It's a little bit, reminds me a little bit of Stockton Rush. If you know aeronautical engineering, does that mean you can navigate the deep sea? And there it says, Cooper summited Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, the tallest mountains in Africa, and Popocatépetl, or whatever, Popocatépetl, the volcanic behemoth in Mexico. So he does have some climbing experience, and I would have to say, if you've climbed Kilimanjaro, then you've got quite a good schooling, right? You do have quite a good schooling because Kilimanjaro is almost the closest mountain to Aconcagua that's lower than Aconcagua, right? So, and he didn't only climb Kilimanjaro. Mount Kenya is also quite a high mountain. And then there it is. In 1966, Cooper joined NASA just as the Apollo program got underway. And what that suggests to me is that he got caught up in the whole moon thing, because from 1966 to 1972 is 6 years. It kind of also gives me the idea, I don't know how chronologically accurate this is, but you kind of get the idea that he climbed Kilimanjaro before he joined NASA. Don't you get that idea? And then once the Apollo program was kind of completed, then he wanted to climb the next mountain. And they say he was a bit of a swashbuckler. He was more like an astronaut than a desk engineer. He sometimes wore a beard. Okay. So in his favor, we can say he wasn't completely inexperienced. And the question then arises, is climbing Kilimanjaro sufficient schooling for Aconcagua? And I must say, I would put up my hand and say yes. I would say, I think that's, if you've climbed Kilimanjaro, and I have, you would say, okay, I know what 6,000 meters feels like. Aconcagua is just under 7,000 meters, so kind of been there, been 6/7 of the way, done that, right? In other words, it's definitely a assumption I would make, which is I've climbed Kilimanjaro. I think I know what I'm dealing with here, right? Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So here are a couple of pictures. It's really a good article in the New York Times. As I say, a link is in the description. In 1966, Cooper joined NASA. He smoked a pipe. He drove an old military Jeep, sometimes taking his nieces for a ride. So what they're trying to say is that he kind of had not an attitude, not an ego, but he kind of had charisma. He was someone that was aware that he was on a kind of a journey. And the sense that I get is that he was bookending his NASA experience with mountains, where before and I don't know this for a fact, I'm just assuming that before the Apollo program, he climbed the highest mountain in Africa, then he did the Apollo program, and then he thought, I want to go the next step. Bear in mind, he was only 36 years old, right? And you also get that because he was a Coast Guard pilot, and there's a little bit of a military thing there, he's kind of aware of that thing in the military where you go up a level, up a level, up a level, up a level. And so he wants to do the same thing in terms of his career, in terms of climbing mountains, right? I mean, my natural thought after I climbed Kilimanjaro was, okay, what's the next obvious mountain? And the next obvious mountain is Aconcagua. Here's Cooper as a child. He was an Eagle Scout with a love of the outdoors. Right? So he's not, he's an academic, but he does have a little bit of, what's the word? He is a bit of an outdoorsy fellow. It's not as though he's not at all. He's not a total nerd, right? So let's go back to his backstory. Let's just pull it up a bit more. At NASA, he fell in love with a secretary, a divorced woman named Sandy Myers. They were married in 1968. So even his wife is within this whole NASA experience. In 1969, they had a baby called Randy. That was the year of Apollo 11. Cooper was in the surface operations group that guided Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin as they became the first humans to walk on the moon. So this guy's a real kind of big shot, even in NASA. You would imagine when he walks through the door, even the NASA folk are like tipping their hats to him, right? 3 years later, on December 19, 1972, Apollo 17's three-man crew splashed down safely in the South Pacific. On January 12, 1973, Cooper's flight from Houston landed in Miami, where he met Janet Johnson. They flew together to Argentina. Cooper kept a diary of his expedition. Like other men in the group who wrote in their own diaries, he didn't seem to like her. He literally said there's nothing feminine about her, and actually his instincts were on par, I guess one can say. That he noticed something about her that was different, and he was actually right. He also said Cooper was unsure what to make of the only woman. So you can tell that there's a bit of hesitation. You know, it's not that he embraces her, he is there to hold her hand, he's not there to really support her. You kind of get the sense that he doesn't really like her. In fact, he says, Janet sure is weird. And then he says this. From the comfort of the hotel, he said, she went swimming in her bra and the pool was full of people. And you kind of get the feeling that he didn't really like that. But you kind of get a bit of a chauvinistic feel and kind of a conservative feel that he didn't like her. He found her not feminine to his taste. And she did things that he didn't seem to really approve of. So that's not a very good start to this story. You can imagine if he did like her and she liked him, and others liked her and others liked him, maybe that would have improved their chances. Do you agree with that? Old school. Run the World says Cooper sounds like a jerk. Okay. So can you see there's already trouble brewing in terms of the dynamics? Already the big shot on board is like, that woman is weird and I'm not sure if I like her. And what other folk are perhaps going to take their cue from him? You know, they stopping somewhere to rest. And Cooper says to the doctor, the lawyer, or the physician, or the psychiatrist, what do you think about that she's an odd duck, isn't she? And what if she overheard that? What if somebody else overheard that and went to Janet and said, he's talking smack behind your back, right? And I can tell you now, having climbed Kilimanjaro, that sometimes you do gossip about other people that are around you, and sometimes that gossip boomerangs back to you. I literally had it, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I literally had it where my brother made a comment about someone and she overheard it and blah, blah, blah. So it's a very interesting story, but there's absolutely nothing in there about, well, there is something about Cooper's previous climbing experience, but what is missing from the story is what was Cooper's level of fitness at the time that he went to Aconcagua. I suppose in one sense, you could say you would imagine the NASA staff would all be fairly fit, but he wasn't an astronaut. So could that apply to him? As someone in mission control, would he be physically fit? Well, you would imagine he would need to pass a medical, but not much more than that. So I guess you could assume that he would be of average fitness, right? So the only really useful bit of information that came out of all that was that he'd experienced climbing Kilimanjaro, and perhaps even more importantly, he didn't really seem to like Johnson. Do you agree? Now we're going to deal with Johnson. And I must say, she's got a really interesting journey. Johnson is described as perhaps the most accomplished climber in the group. That's pretty incredible, right? So she's got a climbing pedigree, right? She's coming in, she's a woman, but she's in this group as probably the strongest, toughest, most experienced climber, right? And how are other men going to feel about that? Because in 1973, you can imagine them like Cooper. We expect you to be feminine. We expect you to need our help, all that kind of thing. And here's a woman who has climbed more mountains than any of these men have climbed. How do you think they feel about that? Do they feel happy about that? Do they feel emasculated? Do they feel jealous or envious? Or do they simply feel, what's the word? That they don't really like her because she's the star of their show, right? So let's have a look at this excerpt from the article. Here is what was certain. A woman from Denver, maybe the most accomplished climber in the group, had last been seen alive on the glacier. A man from Texas, part of the recent Apollo missions, lay frozen nearby. So you literally have the two biggest big shots dying on the mountain. And the question is, did someone else kill them, or did their own hubris, their own ego, their own sort of the way the media built them up, did their own reputations kind of precede them up the mountain and they were trying to catch up to them? And then here it is. There were contradictory statements from survivors and a hasty departure. That's a problem. The fact that survivors, their stories couldn't agree with one another, that's a problem. The question is, how serious is it? In true crime, when there are inconsistent statements, it tends to mean someone's lying, someone's covering up. But on a mountain, it doesn't necessarily mean that. People can get confused legitimately. There was a judge who demanded an investigation into possible foul play. It's not just amateur climbers and local reporters. You even have a judge that's looking at all of this and saying, guys, this doesn't look right. And it says here at the end, there were 3 years of summit scratching searches to find and retrieve the bodies. So that's another thing to bear in mind, that for 3 years, the bodies were basically exposed, and the evidence, if there was any, covered up by snow, stripped away by wind, to some extent destroyed by sun, right? Sunshine can destroy DNA. Okay. So Johnson is described as I said, the most accomplished climber. And it actually makes sense that she is described this way, because guess what? At one point, and I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but at one point, the whole group splits into two, right? And guess what part she's on, right? So in other words, they're climbing the mountain, and then the group splits into two, and one part of the group basically says, it's too hard, I can't do it, it's too miserable, the weather's too cold, whatever, The conditions are too difficult. I'm going back. I can't do it. Right? So about half the group basically gives up. The other half say, I'm not going to give up. I think I can do it. Well, which half do you think she was in? Which half do you think John Cooper was in? And then critically, where were the leaders in terms of the split, right? Christina says she's in a group of one. Now, actually, that's quite an interesting question, because ultimately you want to know the people around her when she was in distress. Did they help her? They say they did, but that's the critical question. They say they did, but did they? Because if you look at what happened to John Cooper, did anyone help him? Right? Did anyone help him? Now, he was a man, and the answer is no one helped him, and he died. Were they supposed to help Janet Johnson just because she was a woman? And for me, the answer is kind of yes, right? Two men with one woman beside them, are you supposed to help her? Well, the answer is yes, but then are you legally supposed to help her? No. On a very high mountain, there's not really any law saying you have to help anybody. There's a moral code. There's an ethics to it. There's what you should do, but in another sense, everyone's life is on the line, and everyone goes up there knowing that. If you climb a mountain, you kind of know that it's not anyone else's job to save you, not the expedition leader, not the team doctor. It's no one's job to save you. Neither is it your job to save anybody else. If you can, you do, but it's not absolutely expected from you. And so it's not like you're walking around in your neighborhood and you see someone in distress. This is a situation where it's almost like you're drowning, you're slowly dying. You kind of don't quite have the luxury of putting aside hours and hours of your time to help someone else. Of course, someone who does that is truly heroic, but someone who does that basically has a very good chance of not surviving themselves. So that's a really good question. We're going to deal with that in a second. So now we want to know what really happened when they climbed, but let's continue our backstory of Janet. Let's have a look. Janet never married or had children. Judy Abrahamson, now an 83-year-old widow, is the only close relative alive. She liked to study. That was her favorite thing to do. Now, someone was saying that they thought that Cooper was an academic. I think you could say the same to some extent about Janet. She was a teacher, so she was also an academic. She's asked straight A, she would settle for nothing less. It was when her sister was away at college that Abrahamson discovered notes hidden in a jewelry box, love notes between her sister and another young woman. Soon Johnson's parents sent her to a hospital to cure her of her homosexuality. And there you get a sense of just how different America was in 1973. She was 21 years old and she was sent to a hospital to be cured of homosexuality. Abraham said she wasn't healed by that, but there was a big rift between Janet and my mother. And so, yeah, you already have, in a way, the psychological apparatus for something that is driving Janet, that is driving her far more than any of these other men. Bear in mind, Janet's the most experienced climber, the most accomplished climber. And then the question arises, is she climbing mountains to prove herself, to prove something to herself, to her mother, to other people? What do you think the answer is to that? And so this rift between Janet and her mother chased Johnson away from home. Because of her sexual orientation, she's kind of thrown out of the home, I guess. Her sister stays behind, but she's thrown out. So she settles in Denver. She rents part of a 2-story home on York Street near the Botanic Gardens where she volunteered. And I can tell you now, as someone who's been in Denver, been right through Colorado from one end to the other, you can't be in Colorado without noticing high mountains. You can't be in Colorado without wanting to climb high mountains. You can't be in Colorado without wanting to ski high mountains. And so obviously that is the kind of life that she started experiencing, is life in the mountains. It says she got her teaching certificate, then her master's degree, eventually a PhD in education at the University of Colorado, right? So she studied in Boulder and became a doctor. So she's actually a doctor of teaching. And so she's quite a big shot in terms of her education. And there's a lot driving her in the same way that John Cooper is also a very driven dude, and he's also a big shot. It says here, she taught in elementary schools and became a school librarian. There again is that sense of someone who's both a kind of a nerd and someone who's very interested in the high mountains. So she became a school librarian in order to keep her nights and weekends free for the mountains. So the mountains was, I think, more than anyone else in this group, a part of her life. It was part of her story. It was a part of how she was expressing herself, right? Okay, let's go on to the next thing. So this is her sister. And she says, I want to know what really, really happened to her. Johnson's sister is still troubled by questions about her death. Let's see if I can get a little bit of audio from that. So this is the article. I just want to scroll down to where sister is talking. So that is Janet Johnson's camera that was retrieved. Can you read what it says there? Janet Johnson, 1259 York, Denver, Colorado, right? Okay, so this is 3D animation of the mountain. There's the Polish glacier right at the top. Remember I asked the question, where, if you were caught in a glacier, where was it likely on this mountain? Well, the answer is right below the summit, in that area. So I just want to go back to that. I just want to try and get it full screen. So I think you get a sense from this perspective how high this mountain is. You don't just walk up it and down it in one day. And you can also see that this mountain towers over all the other mountains around it. It's not just a high mountain, part of a range. It's much higher than the surrounding mountains. And you also kind of get a sense of that from behind me. You can clearly see the highest mountain on the horizon. It sticks out well above all the other mountains. I just want to see if I can find what his sister says. I think it's this. Okay.
Well, that's a good one. 1947. Oh, I thought I'd gone through all these. I guess I didn't go through enough of them. Oh, aren't we bathing beauties? Janet was the first adopted, and years later, when she was 5, she wanted a sister.
So that's already giving us another insight here, is that Janet was adopted. Now, is that also going to be something that is going to drive your psychology? Where do I belong? Who am I? Um, how do I fit in terms of the human story? And and is that part of why she was so accomplished? Is that she was getting a sense of who she was and who she was relative to the people around her by being in the mountains?
That's where I came from. I became the sister that Janet wanted. Janet was very tall, straight-shouldered, blonde, very studious, to the point where I was jealous because she was so smart. Janet was my mom's girl. I was my daddy's girl. My dad was an outdoorsman, so he thought it was.
So that's also quite a significant thing, is that Janet was sort of her mother's girl until her sexual orientation came out. And you can imagine how painful that must be if she had such a close relationship with her mother, and then it was her mother who basically rejected her, her adopted mother. So she, in a way, she has like a double rejection. She's adopted, right? And then her mother, her adopted mother, basically throws her out at 21 years of age, right?
Was wonderful that she, took to the outdoors. My mother was a homebody, so she thought maybe she should stay home. And Janet said, nope, I've got to go. I've got to adventure. And she did. And she loved it. I don't know how she could climb all those mountains, but I can't even climb my hill out here. I think Janet was trying to prove to herself and her mother that she could do anything she wanted to.
Okay. So we're going to come back to this. I just want to complete the backstory. And the backstory is Johnson joined the Colorado Mountain Club by 30 years of age. Bear in mind, by the way, thanks a lot, Earth. Earth, thanks. By 30, bear in mind, she went to Aconcagua 5 or 6 years later. She became the 82nd known person and among the first 20 women to reach the summit of each of Colorado's 14ers. So she didn't just casually climb a mountain here and there. She was very committed. So it looks like she climbed more than 50 peaks higher than 14,000 feet in elevation. That's a lot of climbing. Her name is regularly in the club's magazine, Trail and Timberline, detailing various excursions. Photos she took graced the magazine's cover. Let me just say that again. Photos she took were often published on the magazine's cover. So you can see she's kind of getting a sense of self through this mountain journey. She's being recognized as a person in her own right through her mountain adventures, right? The other thing is there's a media aspect to this. She's in a way, what's the word, using or enjoying the publicity of, she climbs a mountain and then she's in a magazine. She climbs a mountain and her photos make the cover of the magazine. And so you can imagine if she goes to Aconcagua, it's kind of obvious that she's got to get to the summit. It's kind of obvious that she's got to take photos. It's kind of obvious that she's got to come back with a good story, right? Compared to all the other climbers, right? She's so invested in climbing that she kind of needs to get this done. And by the way, it doesn't really matter which mountain it is, Everest, Aconcagua, Kilimanjaro. It costs quite a lot of money just to go there and climb. So the idea that, oh, this didn't work out, I'll just come back another day, it doesn't really work. It's quite expensive to get there. It's quite expensive to pay for the whole thing. So you kind of want to make it happen when you're there, even if things aren't ideal, right? And so she's not going to just go there, oh, the weather wasn't so great, bad luck, I'm back. She's going to make a real effort, right? She's going to make a real she's going to make she's going to be very determined in her effort to get to the top of the mountain, right? So it also says the companionship on the outing was tremendous. That is, except for the wood ticks. So she was writing about how the people around her accepted her and liked her, but this is in Colorado. Now, when she goes to Aconcagua, there's a NASA scientist who's from Texas, I think, who doesn't seem to like her, and I don't know if the other guys liked her much either. She wrote, strangely enough, few other people even found one tick. So she's got quite a good sense of humor. More and more, Johnson headed overseas. She was one of 38 members of the 1963 club expedition in Peru. On the way home, she detoured to climb this mountain, which rises more than 17,000 feet near Mexico City. Okay, let's go back to this.
Even as a gay person. If she could have done mountain climbing 24/7, she would have. She was free when she was up there. Felt at peace with herself. She didn't think of herself as a pioneer. She thought of herself as doing what she wanted to do. I'd like to know, what happened and why she wasn't found sooner. I want to know what really, really happened to her.
So she's got quite a strong connection to her sister, and her sister is wanting to know why did it take so long, this investigation, and what really happened, right?
Because she was experienced. And it's been too many years. But I still think about her. No matter how many years go by, Janet was my sister.
And so she's saying, I don't understand this. She was a very experienced climber. This doesn't really make much sense. She climbed all these other mountains, then when she climbs this one, something goes wrong. How did that happen? Right? Okay, so now let's deal with some of her experience. So it says here, it's unclear how many of the world summits she reached. She climbed Kilimanjaro like John Cooper. She hoped to climb Denali after returning. Most summers, Johnson tied a kayak atop a Nash Rambler and headed to the northwest. So you kind of get the sense that she's more experienced than John Cooper, but John Cooper's also climbed Kilimanjaro, which is something. She would stay with her sister, hike Mount Hood, and paddle in Puget Sound. That's in Oregon, right? Isn't it? In 1971, the graduation announcements for a PhD sent out by her mother included a formal portrait of Johnson smiling with her cat eyeglasses on. She wanted to reach the highest levels of education. She wanted to reach the top of tallest mountains. And I think this kind of this almost symbolic way of thinking about mountains, like in the same way that I think John Cooper was thinking, I'm having a career that's going upward. My career trajectory is going up. Well, at the same time, these mountains I'm climbing must be harder and higher, right? It's kind of, I don't want to say confusing. It's kind of mixing the life journey with a kind of a symbolic journey where you're saying, in terms of my career achievements, I also want to achieve in terms of high mountains. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. It's a very human thing to do. It's a very understandable thing to do, but you've got to be very careful saying, well, that mountain was so high. Well, now I must climb a higher mountain and a higher mountain. Okay, but they are going to become deadlier. And sometimes it's not just a case that you climb the higher mountain. Sometimes the very best thing you can do on a particular day on that high mountain is not climb it because of the weather. you don't just go to a mountain and climb it. It seems like that's the way to climb mountains, but there's a very real thing where you can't climb a mountain whenever it suits you. You've got to find the time that the mountain is kind of being gentle, I guess. You've got to find a weather window. Although the weather window situation is not as crucial, so on Aconcagua and even less on Kilimanjaro than it is on Everest, I can tell you when we climbed Kilimanjaro, my brother got caught in a snowstorm on Kilimanjaro, and nothing went wrong. But you don't want to be on a mountain when you can't see anything, when it's just white, right? And that can happen on a mountain that's 3 kilometers high, 6 kilometers high, 9 kilometers high. I went for a walk this afternoon with my dog, and there were these huge storm clouds. I must still put the photos on Instagram, but these big dark gray storm clouds, and it was a risk. Do you go out, and this is not mountains, this is just a short little walk. It is a risk going out there because you could get caught, there could be lightning, and then it did rain cats and dogs about an hour later. So whether it's a mountain, whether it's a high mountain or not a high mountain, you are at the mercy of the weather. You don't just say, you know what, I will do this no matter what. You've got to pay attention to what's around you. And yeah, that is it. It is very unpredictable. What does Run the World say? Someone says, Run the World says, not much has changed. Yeah. Well, I think quite a lot has changed, but something certainly haven't changed for some people, right? Okay, so let's get to the end of this. I think it was just to prove to my mother that she can do these things even as a gay person. You heard her saying this. If Johnson had a significant other, Abrahamson never knew of her. Box of slides only showed landscapes, not people. And I find that quite interesting, a little bit sad, that in all the photos that she took, they're mostly landscapes. And I suppose I could kind of say the same thing. Like when I go to America, I come back with landscapes and crime scenes. There's not a terribly large amount of people in it. Not because I'm gay, I'm not gay, but unfortunately, a lot of the people I know are like, please don't take a photo of me. So, that's kind of understandable, but it's also a little bit unfortunate. Anyway, we'll see when I go the next time. Maybe I can convince a couple. She took 1972, 1973 school year off. That fall, after a hiking trip in Europe, she proudly joined the upcoming Mazamas expedition to Aconcagua. Okay. And that then brings us to basically the quite exciting part is the dynamics. What really happened? Like what happened on the climb? And so yeah, you have confirmation. It looks like I was right. Defoe was in charge. He was the team leader, followed by Petrosky, who is his friend from Portland. So they were pals already. And then there was Eubank, the doctor, and Shelton, the interpreter for Alfonso. Then came Zeller, Macmillan, Cooper, and Johnson without defined roles. So it's quite interesting. Yeah, you've got 4 people with defined roles. You've got leader, deputy leader, doctor, interpreter, right? And then the other 4 don't have defined roles. And here's the freaky part. How many of the people with defined roles do you think split off and went to the summit? Let me ask that question in chat. How many of the group with defined roles headed for the summit? In other words, because there was a point where they split and one group didn't continue up, right? And the other group did. What do you think the answer is? No, but so when I'm asking how many with defined roles headed for the summit, not how many in the group. And that's right, none. So no one with a defined role was part of this split off group that went to the summit, right? So there's no interpreter, but they didn't really need him. There's no doctor, they would have needed him. There was no team leader or deputy team leader who would basically say, guys, we need to do this. So you had no one who had been thinking about the climb in a structured way, in a way that is like, I don't want to say no one, but you could imagine that the team leader has got a schedule and is far more aware of safety, and everyone else is kind of climbing under the team leader. Now the team leader's gone. Now you've got to be your own team leader because you don't have another team leader with you, right? Right. So of the 8 people, 4 had defined roles. None of those 4 went up to the summit. It was the 4, I guess, that were the least likely in a way to go to the summit, maybe excluding Janet Johnson, that went for the summit, right? So you had your 2 celebrities that were part of this group, and guess who the other 2 were? The other 2 were your blue collar guys. The one guy was I think the policeman, and the other guy was the dairy farmer, right? So you've got dairy farmer and policeman who's kind of on one end of the spectrum, with the NASA engineer who's kind of on the other end. In other words, the non-celebrity with the total celebrity. And how do you think they got on? Do you think they got on like a house on fire? Do you think these folks got along really well? So I'm going to just make this a little bit bigger and then just read here. It's tough not to think of both Cooper and Johnson as the stars of the expedition. Cooper because of his NASA pedigree, Johnson because of her climbing pedigree, and because a woman climbing in 1973 was a big deal. The question then arises, did their status relative to other expedition members play a role in what happened to them? And I think you've got to put it in context and say, did their status relative to other expedition members, and now it's the other expedition members that are climbing the last section to the summit. And who are these other expedition members? Well, who would be the most resentful of someone getting all of this glory and all of this attention? Who would be the most resentful of a woman climbing? And I don't know whether you could say that the average dairy farmer would be that, because there are probably some nice dairy farmers. I don't know whether you could say the average police officer would resent a woman being on board and would resent a NASA engineer. But I do think you can ask the question, did these individuals in 1973 resent their companions? So, simple question. Right? Did the relative statuses of, so now you've got the group split into 4 and 4, and there's no defined roles for these 4. And then in a way, the 4 are split again into 2 and 2 in terms of their celebrity status, in terms of what everyone else thinks of them. So you can see how the group is being split and split again and split again. And a group that is being split like that, do you think your chances of survival are getting better whenever that happens? Because the group that's split into 4, where those 4 stayed together, they all survived and they all lived happily ever after. The group that's split into, other group that's split into 4, split again into 3, then split into 2, and then 2 of those died. Right? So what is at work here? The temperament of people or the temperament of the mountain, or both? What's kind of going on here? So what did I write here? Were other expedition members jealous, or did the media drive an additional amount of hubris? And I think at this point it's impossible to say that the media in this story is absolutely irrelevant. The media in this story was very relevant to Janet Johnson because it had been in her whole life. You know, she was in magazines. Was the media relevant to John Cooper? It's very hard to believe that it wasn't. Right? Okay. So here's another photo from this New York Times article. And here you just get a sense of what it looked like, what it felt like. So here you have Macmillan, Shelton, and Zeller. So there's Macmillan. Shelton, I think, was the 25-year-old student. Am I right about that? The college student. And then Zeller is the other one. Macmillan, I think, is the farmer. Zeller, I think, is the police officer. And so of these three, this guy wouldn't be part of the group going up. He was the interpreter. He had a defined role. And you can see here, three of them are basically climbing alone. Three of them are climbing in a group. You can see no one behind them. And I'm not sure who took the photo. Maybe it was the guide. I'm not sure. Then here's holding a map of Aconcagua. Defoe called it one of the most barren places in the universe. Quite a statement to make. This also gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Let me take myself out. So there's Macmillan in the orange jacket. Macmillan is the dairy farmer. Just want to check on that. I think that's right. Just check whether I've got that correct. I mean, while we're here, we might as well just look at the whole group again, right? So the group is Alfonso, the guide. There's Defoe. Defoe's the leader. Petrosky's the deputy leader. Bill Eubank. Arnold Macmillan, he's the dairy farmer. So he's part of the group that goes to the top. He's the only one of these five that goes to the top. Bill Zeller, he's the police officer. There's John Shelton, he's the college student. And so it's these two fellows, Macmillan and Zeller, that go with, and they are 46 and 45, who go with Cooper and Johnson, who are 35 and 36. And I think you've also got to ask the question, the fact that you've got two mid-40 somethings, and they are in the company of two people that are 10 years younger, do they feel a bit insecure about them? Do they feel a bit resentful about them? Do they feel they know better than them? How do they feel about these people in their midst, right? Okay. So let's go back to this image. So here you see Macmillan, and he's one of the guys, he's the dairy farmer. He was one of the stronger climbers. He's in the orange jacket. Is that orange or is that orange? I'm not sure who that is. Is that orange or is that orange? Well, there's another climber sitting at the bottom here. Now, something that I personally really don't like about Aconcagua is because it's so barren, you as a climber are expected to collect your own feces. So you don't just go up the mountain, do your thing and come back down. You've got to literally collect your feces all the way from the bottom to the top and carry it with you the whole way. And that's something I'd really not like to do. Thank you very much. Can you imagine if you sit on your backpack and when you open it, it's a mixture of clothing and feces? So that's one aspect that really makes this climb for me not particularly fun sounding, right? Okay, so if it's tempting to think Cooper died by accident because of inexperience, that explanation isn't going to fly as well with Johnson, who was a lot more experienced. Having said that, on Everest in 1996, we saw completely inexperienced climbers perish alongside seasoned expedition leaders. So you've got to be careful having a very narrow view of this. It doesn't mean that, I mean, you would imagine of that whole group that the leader is going to make it to the top, the deputy leader is going to make it to the top, the physician is going to make it to the top, the mountain guide is going to make it to the top, and that's just not the case, right? So although the New York Times writer fleshes out the identities and dynamics fairly well, and although he does introduce Aconcagua's vital statistics, I'm not sure he does a good enough job introducing the mountain as a character in its own right, right? What I mean by that is, I think you should introduce the climbers, which we've done. I think you need to introduce the victims, which we've done. But I also think you need to spend quite a lot of time on the mountain itself and get a sense of the mountain's temperament, the various routes up the mountain, what the mountain is like as a person, if I can put it that way. Right? I mean, you can, in a way, think of the mountain as a serial killer. The mountain's already killed 153 people. How many people does this mountain kill every year? What is a normal murder rate for this mountain? It may sound like a silly thing to be asking, but basically what you're asking is, every year the mountain kills a certain amount of people, and people don't say they were murdered. And so in 1973, how many people died? And how many people die on average in the average year? It's a kind of a simple thing, right? It's a kind of a statistical way of approaching this question. And so what do they say here? Aconcagua is the broad-shouldered behemoth of the Andes, shaped more like a fist than a finger. It's quite a big mountain. It is brown and rocky, scrubby and dusty, dry and wind-whipped, with few trees or wild flowers. It can feel like a vertical desert. The first person known to reach the summit was this guy. So what's quite incredible with Aconcagua is it sometimes seems like a really tough mountain to climb, and then you see 9-year-olds have done it. And you, like, I think the youngest person to ever have climbed this mountain was 9 years old. And then I think the youngest girl is 12 years old. So how hard can it be? But these people climbed it via the normal route. The Americans climbed via a more difficult route called the Polish glacier route, and then they had bad weather. So you've got that as a compounding factor. And then on top of that, they lost their support structure. They lost the doctor, they lost the expedition leader, they lost the deputy expedition leader, right? They lost their mountain guide. Okay. And this is very important to bear in mind in terms of what we're dealing with. So if you're saying, I think people murdered people, you must bear in mind you're dealing with a mountain that is, regardless, the mountain is a serial killer. It's killed 153 people already. Were these two victims part of that tally? Or was there, within this whole thing, something weird that happened in 1973? Like I say, I've climbed Kilimanjaro, and I sort of feel like I actually don't think I want to climb this mountain. Maybe if I can build up my motivation, maybe I would. But look at this. Aconcagua is not easy. Trouble lurks in the thin air. Through 2022, there were 153 known deaths. In 1973, Johnson and Cooper were numbers 26 and 27. Now, I may be misunderstanding things, but as I understand it, Cooper died first. So Cooper is actually number 26 and Johnson is number 27. That's also quite interesting. And I could be wrong. Maybe I misunderstood it. But it's quite interesting to think that Cooper, the man in the story, was the weaker climber in a sense. We do know that he went down first. And then Johnson certainly climbed further and higher than Cooper did. But I might be misunderstanding this. As far as I know, Cooper was number 26, Johnson was number 27. 50 years ago, Aconcagua had only the most rudimentary of services, no GPS trackers, no way to communicate between base camp and the summit. All the Americans carried was binoculars and a flare gun. And you can imagine in a situation like that, both the degree of difficulty compounds, but also if someone wants to do anything mischievous, well, there's no way to know in terms of radio. There's no radio that's going to, deal with that. The other thing is, how can I put this? If you are trying to stay alive, if you are trying to survive in a mountain, in a weird way, you are kind of in this mode. You're kind of in a me, narcissistic mode, right? You're not really thinking, I would like to murder that person. And even if you were, it's going to require effort. And, after standing up, you're going to be exhausted. After going like this, you're going to be quite tired. You can't really have like a tussle for any extended length of time as a human being at that altitude. You are just too exhausted. And so, to be honest, when I climbed Kilimanjaro and you really, really high up, your mind is barely functioning. It's almost like going zzz, zzz, right? So I really don't think you're going to be stringing together thoughts like that, although part of the thought process is paranoia. You can sometimes become a little bit paranoid and see things that aren't there. Does that translate to a murderous intent? Well, that's the question. If trouble came, there was virtually nobody to help but other members of the expedition. Okay, now I want to divert quickly and deal with the mountain as a character as briefly as I can, right? And that's under this whole thing of degree of difficulty. So he's at least given you an idea. It's not an easy mountain. It wasn't an easy time to be climbing the mountain. They didn't really have that much equipment, but let's go into that in a little bit more detail. An average of 3 people per year die on Aconcagua. I don't know if he mentions that in his article, but I think that's quite an important thing to bear in mind. Right? An average of 3 people every year die on Aconcagua. Do you think people say, I think they murdered each other? That's quite a rare thing. So what we're saying through this, without being insensitive, is that you can expect people to die on this mountain. Every year you can expect 3 people to die. It's not clear, I don't have this information, it's not clear how many died in 1973, but we know that 2 of them were Cooper and Johnson. So, the other thing is you didn't have 6 people dying in this expedition or 7 people, you had a number that is quite close to the average per year. So what is clear is instead of looking at a mountain, when you see an image like this, let me just take myself away and that away, right? And let's just make it a little bit bigger, right? Instead of seeing a mountain, when you see this image, you should actually be seeing a graveyard, right? I'm not kidding when I say that. Instead of seeing this mountain, wow, it's so high, it's so beautiful, you're actually seeing a graveyard. You're seeing a place where 153 people have died. Some of them are still lying there. When you look at Mount Everest, you shouldn't be seeing, wow, what a beautiful, it's the world's highest mountain. You should be seeing 330 people have died on that mountain. And probably most of them are still on the mountain, right? You are actually looking at a graveyard, right? It's a little bit like Titanic. When you go down to Titanic, you're not really seeing Titanic, you're seeing a graveyard. There, like over 1,000 people died, right? So I know it sounds a bit weird, but this is not a mountain, it's actually a graveyard. And you're going to be walking among graves to get to the top and walking among graves to get back down. And so again, when somebody does die on the mountain, is it this big mystery? No, a lot of people have died on the mountain, and 3 die every year. And so that what that already does is it mitigates against the foul play scenario. Now, at the moment, I'm not saying it's an accident. I'm saying you've got to be aware of these statistics to have a reasonable, realistic view of what likely happened here. It's not just that someone climbed a mountain and they died, and wow, were they murdered? People are climbing the mountains constantly. People are dying on the mountain constantly. What is a fact in this particular expedition is that there are very inconsistent statements. And when you look at certainly the dynamics, you can see that people didn't get along. Now, does that mean they murdered each other? What is more likely that the mountain did its thing as usual, especially with people not getting along very well, or that people really didn't get along? What is more likely? It does have kind of a Mars-like landscape. Danny, have you gone to Aconcagua? I must say the scree on Kilimanjaro is also like another planet. When you on the volcanic rim of Kilimanjaro, it sort of feels like space, just because there's no living thing up there. There are no butterflies or birds or moss or plants of any kind. Like an eagle might pass by here or there, but generally not. And so all you see and feel at the top of that mountain is gas and sunlight and wind, and that's about it, and rock. So you feel like you're on another planet just on the top of Kilimanjaro. Okay, so yes, just a reminder of the route. We know that there are 3 routes up Aconcagua, and the American expedition chose the harder one, climbing via the Polish glacier. This also mitigates against a foul play narrative and aggravates in terms of human weakness. So if someone had died on the easier route, then you could definitely say, wow, maybe there was some bickering going on and someone lashed out. But the fact that they chose the harder route, and there were serious weather issues, and there was splintering, and it was very, very high up, kind of suggests that human weakness may have come into this. Human weakness, not in the sense of someone doing evil things, but someone succumbing to the power of nature, right? Aconcagua is tougher by several degrees of difficulty compared to, say, Kilimanjaro. Now, what I can't help thinking is I've climbed Kilimanjaro, And for a long time, I thought, yeah, Aconcagua makes sense. If you don't really research it, if you don't really look at what you're dealing with, Aconcagua isn't like Kilimanjaro slightly harder. Aconcagua is a lot harder than Kilimanjaro, right? Every every couple of 100 meters beyond a certain point is extremely hard beyond that point. So I can tell you, when you're at Kilimanjaro is about 6 kilometers high, a little bit lower than that. But when you're at that altitude, your brain's operating at almost like 50% IQ. You're not very smart. You're not very conscious. You're very much in this kind of frame. You are on top of the world and you don't even look around you. You're like a zombie, right? That's at 6,000 meters. This is another 1,000 meters up. If you're at the camp on Kilimanjaro, the last camp, so I can tell you, we left at about 1 o'clock in the morning, midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. We were too cold to sleep, right? This is at, what is it, 4,500 meters. You're already too cold to get rest and you can't sleep. Now, imagine a mountain that's another kilometer above that with rest camps where you're not going to get any sleep either. So beyond a certain point, you're just kind of going backwards, right? So Aconcagua is higher than Kilimanjaro. It takes longer. It involves more isolation, more extreme weather, and thus specialized climbing gear and climbing experience. I'm going to tell you something that's so obvious, but if you didn't know this, it could cost you your life, right? So you've climbed, Jean Karras, good to see you. Sorry, JC, sorry, I got that wrong. It's easy to imagine you climbed Kilimanjaro and now I can just climb Aconcagua. It's a little bit higher, but it's completely different because it's going to take much longer. I think Kilimanjaro takes 4 or 5 days. Aconcagua takes about a week. So 2 or 3 extra days. You're going to have more extreme weather than on Kilimanjaro. Like on Kilimanjaro, I can almost say weather's kind of almost not a factor. Well, on Aconcagua, it's very definitely a factor. The wind is going to be much stronger. It's a totally different situation. You're also going to need specialized climbing gear. Do you know you need a full, what do they call them? I think it's called a down suit. You've got to wear a down suit on Aconcagua, whereas you don't need one on Kilimanjaro. So it's already telling you it's much colder, just that, on Aconcagua. It's not like, okay, I climbed that, I can climb that. It's a totally different ball game, right? Okay, so now we're dealing with the actual climb, right? They plodded upward to establish base camp 3, behind an outcropping of boulders at the base of the Polish glacier at about 19,400 feet. And this is where the issues come up. A storm sweeps through, right? So look at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a mountain that does take a certain number of lives. Let me just do a quick search. Number of fatalities on Kilimanjaro. Number of fatalities on Kilimanjaro. What do you think it is? I'd say under 100. Well, there are more deaths on Kilimanjaro than Aconcagua, but I imagine it's because there are far more people that go up it. 30,000 to 50,000 people climb Kilimanjaro on an annual basis. So the death rate is 0.0136%. One death per 7,300 climbers. So, okay, so that's the fatality rate on Kilimanjaro. I think you'll agree it's extremely low, right? Like on a number by number basis, more people die on Kilimanjaro than Aconcagua, but I think the mountain with the most fatalities in the world is Table Mountain in South Africa, just because millions of people climb it every year. I just want to see death rate on Aconcagua. It doesn't really give you the same rate. Oh, there it is. It's got a fatality rate of 0.77 per thousand. What did I just say? Okay, so that's the fatality rate on Kilimanjaro, right? One death per 7,000. Aconcagua, almost one per thousand. So I don't know how good my math is in this, but I'd say Aconcagua is 7 times more dangerous than Kilimanjaro. Do you agree with that? 1 per 1,000. 1 per 7,000. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that equates to around about Aconcagua being 7 times more deadly than Kilimanjaro? So it's not twice as deadly. It's 7 times more deadly. That's if my math is accurate. I'm doing this very quickly, a little bit on the fly. Let's have a look at the death rate on Everest. It also averages to 4.4 deaths per year. Can you believe it? It's actually quite low. Death rate on Everest per 1,000. Fatality ratio, well, that's basically say it's about 1%. So 0.1 per 1,000, right? Let's have a look at the death rate on K2. I don't know if we're going to get to that. Fatality rate of around 13.7%. So per 1,000, I take it is 1.37%. No? I don't know. Anyway, it's late. It's past midnight. I shouldn't even be here. You know, I'm dealing with this kind of math. Been loving the rewatch. Thanks a lot for that. Okay. Okay, I need to kind of wrap up. Okay, so let's go back to this. So the point is a storm sweeps through, they're climbing on the harder route, they split up, and the least capable, two of the least capable climbers, in terms of they don't have any role, right? They don't have any, I don't know least capable is the best word. Two of the least responsible climbers, is probably the best way of putting it, are now climbing with the two celebrity climbers. Is that a recipe for disaster, or isn't it? And so the storm sweeps through, they rest on that day. But of course, when a storm sweeps through, what happens? There's suddenly a lot of snow, and right, there's snow at the summit, and now you've got to break trail through that snow, and that's gonna be exhausting. When it snowed on a summit and you've got to break trail, then that is going to complicate matters a lot more as well. So anyway, here it is. The group was expecting to take at least all day, meaning taking a rest day because of the storm. But the lower part of the glacier seemed to present no problem, as it seemed to be in good condition, good snow, etc. But after a late breakfast, so yeah, this is where things go wrong. You have the storm, which the group uses as a rest day, and then the deputy leader suddenly loses his coordination. So you're at a very high altitude where things like this do start going wrong. When I climb Kilimanjaro, there's someone who's like also lost his coordination, couldn't really walk properly. He's like walking like a drunk person, right? And so Petrosky is out. He's out of the whole game. Alfonso escorts Petrosky back to base camp. So now they've lost their expedition guide, right? So Petrosky is kind of a casualty, and someone who's supposed to look out for others has also been lost. Now the American team was cleaved in half. Gone with the expedition leader, the deputy, the doctor, the interpreter, and the local guide. I've left out a little bit of other things that were taking place. Remaining were Cooper, Johnson, Zeller, and Macmillan, right? And these are the group that have no role, right? And none of this group had ever been this high anywhere before, and this is a critical problem. Not one of these four had ever been this high before, so they don't really know what is the turnaround time, how should you pace yourself. They don't even really know the route. They never really climbed this way before, so they don't even have a guide. And they barely know one another. Like none of them really know one another. So they're four strangers literally going into the unknown in terms of the mountain itself, but also in terms of the height of the mountain. And there's no one around them to say, yeah, this is normal. Okay, let's get moving, whatever. When they look up, they see the Polish glacier stretching to the sky. And so they then take the next step. And so let me ask you guys a very simple question. Just based on what we know so far, did the incident happen high or low in the mountain? Did things go awry, high or low in the mountain? And then the question is it more likely that the environment, the thin air, the cold, the elements killed these climbers, or is it more likely that climbers killed other climbers? Thanks a lot, Christina. Right? And the answer is kind of the obvious answer, which is they were high up. Right? Let's follow the route that you've got to take up this mountain. Right? Base camp, look at all of this is like below the clouds. Then you climb above the clouds, 16,000 feet, all this way. Then you're at Camp 2, right? And now you're starting to see the tops of mountains. Now you pass the tops of mountains, and this is really high. I just want to check the height of Kilimanjaro. Is it height of Kilimanjaro? Isn't it 18,000 feet? 19,000 feet. So Kilimanjaro is somewhere around here. Can you guys see that? If you look at this whole mountain, Kilimanjaro is about there. That's the top of Kilimanjaro. Maybe a little bit higher. Maybe it's about there. Look how much higher you've got to climb, and look how steep it is to get to the top, right? So Kilimanjaro, which is not so difficult, well, this is the part that makes it 7 times harder, this little piece here. Thanks a lot, Cheryl. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Okay, does that make sense? So they are in this area now, Camp 3, and this is where shit happens. In this piece that's the last piece that's poking out here. So the higher up the incident occurred, the better the chance it was human error or the weather as opposed to foul play. Do you agree with that? On the other hand, as climbers climb higher, you could also say stress levels increase, as does the pressure on the individual climber to deliver. Both victims died above Camp 3, which is to say up high on the mountain. Now, my personal feeling is, as I say, when you're very high on these mountains, you're not thinking, you may well have feelings of resentment to other climbers. In fact, I did when I climbed. You sort of feel like you went ahead of me, and I asked you for water and you didn't give me any, and you did this and you did that. And, you know, I remember when we were climbing, my father knocked over, someone had taken like an hour to boil water, and my father kind of walked by and he knocked it over by mistake. And the guy totally lost his temper. My father was like, sorry, you know, but I don't know why you're getting so angry. And I'm thinking, maybe you should apologize a bit more. This guy was boiling water for an hour. You know, my father was just like, sorry, you know, I didn't do it on purpose. Well, maybe apologize a bit more. So you kind of are thinking about those things, but you're not as, you don't have as much agency up high like that as you do at ground level. And so you very much are in like a little tunnel. You're like, your whole world is, can I put the next foot in front of the other? Can I put the next foot in front of the other? Can I breathe? When am I going to go to the toilet again? When should I eat again? Why am I so sleepy? When is this pounding headache going to stop? Right? Yeah, you totally are in your own world, and you can't be preoccupied on whatever, murdering someone else. You'll trip over your own feet. Anyway, so both victims died above Camp 3, very high in the mountains. Let's just highlight that. So now we come down to it. Is it human error? Is it bad weather? Or is it foul play? Now we're going to deal with where they died, how they died, and what happened. Okay. So we have a situation much like we see in the plot of disaster movies like Aliens. The expedition leader is gone, and then in short shrift, all the essential components as well. The doctor disappears, the interpreter's gone, the computers don't work or they shut down, the power fails. And now in this situation, experience becomes paramount. And guess what? No one has any experience here. No one has any experience in this environment. And so should they have rested at Camp 3? Yeah, that's one thing they could have done. Basically, they needed to climb as a group with a guide, right? So the question here is, do they have enough experience to deal with climbing, right? Do they know what they're doing? So So let's deal with this. Okay. Let's just get rid of that. Okay. Alfonso escorted Petrosky, who is the deputy, back to base camp. Now the American team was cleaved in half, gone with the expedition leader, right? It was sunny, their jackets were unzipped, and everything seemed fine. A storm had moved through, so it felt like everything's cool. We've got our weather window. The weather's actually nice and warm. Let's do it. So they wore crampons and carried ice axes and light packs, leaving most of their possessions behind at camp. Was that a good decision? I don't know. I don't know what they were supposed to do, but they decided that was what they're going to do. Movement up the glacier was slow. Now, just look at that in combination. You've left most of your possessions behind at camp, including your sleeping bag, right? Just that. You've left behind your sleeping bag, and you are now going up the mountain, but you're going extremely slowly. So guess what happens? You don't get to the summit before nightfall, and so now you've got to sleep at 21,000 feet. You've got to spend the night. Let's just go back to the that graphic. You've got to spend the night above here, somewhere over there. Do you think that alone is a good thing? Right? There's Camp 3. They spent a long time climbing up here, and then they ended up not getting to the summit, so they slept above 21,000. Now, I can tell you, we slept at something like 4,500 meters on Kilimanjaro. Well, not slept, temporarily rested. And you felt like it was too cold to sleep, just cold constantly. Your water was constantly freezing. This is much higher than that. And you don't even have a camp. You don't have, I don't think they had a sleeping bag. They had nothing. They had no sleeping bags, no tents, but they must spend a night out. And now it's quite serious. Now it's 4 climbers who have never been this high that are now sleeping outside this high. Welcome, Lynn Cartier. Right? Yeah, it is a bad idea. Very bad idea. And so let's go back a step. Do you think sleeping out at night helped the survival chances of this entire group? And then you take another step and you say, do you think the sleeping out at night is what caused the murder? And like every step along the way, you could definitely say, yeah, well, a murder could also have happened. But you can also see how there's human error constantly. Human error, and it's making people physically weaker and weaker and weaker, right? Okay, so let's just go back to that particular one. Okay. So they dug a small snow cave. They don't have a tent, and so they're digging in the snow to make a kind of shelter. And you can imagine that's going to be cold work. You know, you're digging in the ice, and now you're going to sit in the ice. They have no sleeping bags, and so all they lay on was a reflective space blanket, right? And they've made a little bit of a dent, a little bit of a hole in the face of the mountain. You can imagine that they're not going to make too much of a dent in hard ice, right? But maybe they can get a little bit of shelter. And so they say during the night, Johnson and Zeller moved outside. So you already have 2 people in the group feeling like this isn't really working for me. So they sit outside the cave shivering. And bear in mind, Johnson would later die. You think that is a good situation. You've made a shelter. The shelter is not even adequate. So you're basically sitting exposed on this very, very high mountain, shivering right through the night. Wind blew a fine powder off the summit, filling the opening of the cave with snow and burying Cooper's legs. Johnson unburied him about an hour before sunrise. It was too late, really. So this is a very clear indication that you're dealing with very inexperienced climbers. You literally have Cooper falling asleep and allowing snow to cover his legs. And I'm not going to say ice his legs, but basically, in a sense, refrigerate his legs. And so Johnson unburies him, and it shows you of the climbers, she was the one that had the most sense to know we need to get his legs out of the snow. And the fact that she does it an hour before sunrise gives you an idea how long his legs may have been submerged in the snow or in the ice, probably for several hours. Do you think that's going to be very good for Cooper's survival chances? What is unburied him. Cooper was finished at that point. So the next morning, they spend a night exposed somewhat in this very high part of the mountain, above 21,000 feet. And the next morning, Cooper's like, that's it for me. I'm done. He's cold, he's tired, his legs are sore, and he decides he's going to turn back. And that's according to Zella and Macmillan's story. Bear in mind, they come back down the mountain, and it's their story. This is what happened. They say this guy that was with them he got his legs covered in snow. So you could also say, is this a likely story, or is this not the truth? Did something else happen? It was about 2 hours down the glacier back to Camp 3. That's what Macmillan figured. He thought, it's not going to take him very long. So he said, why don't you just go? You go down, and the three of us are now going to go up the rest of the way. Right? And I know some of you will have alarm bells at this point. You'll say, that looks a bit like foul play. The fact that they expressed little concern about letting Cooper go alone. I can tell you when I climbed, now some of you are going to say, geez, you an arsehole. When I climbed Kilimanjaro, I was climbing with my brother. And my brother at one point I won't say he collapsed, but he just suddenly sat down really heavily, and he said, I'm not going to go any further until I get water. And he asked me if I had water, and I probably had less than a quarter of a bottle of water. In other words, I didn't have enough water for myself. So he asked me for water, and I said, I think you should wait for my father to come and ask him for water, right? And in a way, what I was doing was doubly reckless. It was reckless for me to be proceeding without water for myself. And in another way, it was quite reckless just to leave my brother, because he was obviously in a little bit of distress. But like I say, you are kind of like this. You're not really thinking very logically or rationally. And I also didn't have, if I think about it now, I'm quite shocked, quite surprised, but I can also put myself in my own shoes there. And you're like, so fucked, basically. You farting and burping, you can't really use the toilet, you have a headache, you kind of feel like a sick person in a way. You're not in 100% state of functioning. And so I didn't have that much concern when I left my brother. I've got quite a bit of concern now talking about it, but at the time I was like, just wait here, and I'm sure Dad will have water. But I didn't wait with him. So I left my brother, and I went off and I climbed with not enough water. And my water situation was remedied because I asked someone that was a friend of my father, who was climbing with orange juice. And if he didn't have orange juice, I don't know what I would have done. He gave me a couple of sips of orange juice, and somewhere on the way down, still quite high up on the mountain, we actually found a tap that where the water was actually running, and I ended up filling my bottle there. But if there wasn't that, I don't know what I would have done. So I was climbing Kilimanjaro the idiot's way, right? The point I'm trying to say is not having that much concern for another climber when you're that high, isn't that unusual? It doesn't mean you're a murderer. It doesn't mean you're a psychopath. It means you are compromised, right? I don't know if I would want to climb any higher, but I do want to climb. I do want to climb around do the Annapurna circuit, which is around about. It's certainly not higher than 6,000 meters. I wouldn't want to go higher than that. Yeah, so you are kind of going into survival mode. And you must remember when you in survival mode, you are so limited. You're not in a mode of I'm here to save you. You're in a mode of I'm here to save me. I'm trying to stay alive, right? So you are very inner focused. How am I feeling? When should I eat? How is this? How is that? And even if you try to talk to someone else, it's difficult. So the other I had a sore throat. The other person is coughing. The wind's blowing. Anyway, it sounds like I'm making a lot of excuses. Okay, so let's go on to the next thing. Okay, so there's our answer. Cooper died basically because he allowed his legs to freeze overnight and never recovered. Do you agree with that, or do you think that I'm jumping to conclusions there? Do you agree with this statement? Cooper died basically because he allowed his legs to freeze overnight and then he never recovered. In other words, when he climbed down, he didn't really warm up. He may have gotten lost, but he basically critically compromised himself that night high on the mountain. So I think it's plain to say, based on what we know, maybe the story we've been told about Cooper's not true, but based on what we know, it looks like Cooper died naturally. And I mean, if you think about this from where we started, this is a NASA engineer, a NASA scientist, right? And it seems like a stupid mistake, but it's just a human mistake. It's a NASA scientist on a mountain is not a climbing scientist. It's just a man on a mountain, and he made a very simple mistake. Just keep your legs warm, keep yourself warm. And the fact that the other two went outside and they were shivering also kind of meant that the snow fell off them. If you were inside and you weren't moving, the snow could pile onto you. Timmy, come. Okay, so let's read He appeared to be very capable, alert. Zealous said, that's the police officer. He had no trouble with his reasoning. There was no concern about his climbing ability, and we were not too far above high camp. But John Cooper never made it. He died on the glacier. Not long after, so did Janet Johnson. You must remember, everyone right now is compromised. Everyone is cold. Everyone is everyone is tired. Another big factor that you're dealing with is insomnia. Like when we climbed Kilimanjaro, you left at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you climbed up and down for about 13 hours straight, right? So you are going to have chronic lack of sleep, and that's also going to affect your decision making. So the fact that Johnson came, think about this, the fact that Johnson came to Cooper's aid, Cooper didn't seem to really like Johnson. Cooper thought of Johnson as a weirdo. And yet this woman that he didn't like was helping him. She unburied him, she dug him out, and it showed that Johnson at that stage was both strong and considerate. She wasn't resentful. She bore no enmity, at least towards Cooper. But I think there might be a little bit of a clue here, is in the fact that Johnson helps Cooper, but you get the idea that Zeller and Macmillan aren't being particularly helpful. I mean, Macmillan supposedly was sitting right next to Cooper in the ice cave. Didn't he not notice what's happening to the guy right next to him? You'd imagine the guy sitting right next to him would say, "Jeepers, your legs are full of snow. Let me do something about it." But it's someone else who's on the outside of the ice cave that's got to come inside, that's got to sort out the situation. Yeah, it is like every man for himself. Okay. So it also makes sense from an accident scenario that both climbers died at a similar point in the timeline and at a similar altitude. Of course, we would also expect if there was foul play, that would likely happen simultaneously as well. What I'm trying to say is when things are getting to be so extreme, weather-wise, the elements-wise, coldness-wise, that it's like life-threatening, then you would expect climbers will die at the same point. You see in the 96 Everest disaster, you see, I think it's Hansen and Hall died about the same point. You see Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers, although Namba died and Beck Weathers survived, they're both in serious distress at the same point. You see Scott Fisher and that Taiwanese climber Makulu Gore struggling, immobile at the same point as well, right? So when climbers experience distress, it is often at a particular point on the mountain, right? And so if you're going to say they were murdered, well, you're saying they were murdered at a point which is very difficult to survive anyway. And so if they were murdered if the bodies were found or the death occurred much lower down, the murder would make a lot more sense. You must remember the murderer has also got to have some agency. You don't have agency when you are trying to stay alive and stay warm and all that kind of thing. Also, the higher you go up the mountain, the more slippery it kind of is. You can't just run around and do gymnastics in your murderous attack, right? It's kind of a precarious slope. And anyway, okay. And now we deal with the rumors and the statements that were made by the survivors. What did the survivors say happened? So exactly what happened is speculation. Two men from Oregon, so that the two blue-collar dudes came back to tell the story, and then that's this guy, that's Macmillan, who was in the snow cave with, do I have it right? Yeah, I think he was in the snow cave with Cooper, and Zeller, who was the policeman, he was outside with Cooper. They were the last to see them alive. They gave detailed versions of events, so they were interrogated, and they didn't really make much sense. So their stories didn't quite make any sense. And so then it doesn't make sense to say you're lying, or what you're saying is not true, or what you're saying isn't the same as what he's saying. And like I say, I don't think you can say that this is the same as a suspect making a statement to the police, because at that level, you aren't particularly intelligent, and you do think in a weird way. Like I say, I'm appalled that I left my brother the way I did, but I also know how I was climbing without even looking at the view. Like, you very, very high above the world, and you're like, I don't actually give a shit about the view. Like, I can't believe how miserable I am, right? And I wonder when this pounding headache's going to go away. And the thoughts that I do remember, bizarrely enough, was I remember thinking about a particular kind of hamburger, a steer burger. I was thinking, wow, a steer burger right now would be delicious. And I was thinking about the cranberries. And it's not particularly intelligent thought processes going on, right? I remember when I was on the summit of Kilimanjaro and I handed the camera to someone to take the photo, it seemed to need 7 attempts to take the photo, because every time I gave him the camera, the battery would sort of freeze. So he'd give me the camera back, I'd turn it off, I'd sort of warm the camera against my chest, give it back to him. It takes so long to focus, get the camera oriented, that it would freeze again. And I was almost like panicking, like, he's not going to be able to take this photo, right? But it just gives you an idea of how dumb people are at that altitude. They can't even take a photograph. Christina says, this whole thing is reckless, if not stupid. You can say that about any adventure. You can say that about any trip into nature, that the whole thing is stupid. Why don't you just stay at home? And the answer is because you want an experience of being alive. And for some people, that experience of being alive is valuable and meaningful. And of course, there's risk involved. There is definitely risk involved. There is adventure in terms of the risk. The less you risk, the less adventure there is. So, for example, you might say, I don't want a lot of risk in my life, or then just go for a walk to the nearby park, right? And I could have said the same thing about my travels through America after I got COVID. It was a risk to do that. And if you don't take a risk, you don't get the adventure. That's kind of how it works. And you could die, yes. Death is definitely possible. Did you get the shot? I did before I went, but 6 months before. Anyway, so let's get back on track. Timmy, stop snoring. So these are the people. So you can see this guy's got a bandage on his eye. Alfonso had snow blindness. Remember, he's the guy that came all the way down. Shelton, there's Shelton. He was the college student. Bustos, they were all held by the investigators as well. What's your story? Zella's forehead was blackened from exposure. This is Zella over here. You can see that blackness on his forehead shows that although he survived, he almost didn't, right? You can see the look on his face. You know, he's been through something severe. He's also got what looks like an injury across his nose, right? Okay, we're going to deal with Johnson's death next. Timmy, stop snoring. Okay, so I'm going to take you guys through this account, and then the question is, what's missing from it, right? What is missing from this account? Hey, stop snoring. Okay, so again, what's missing from this account? See if you can think about that while we're going through it. We're dealing now with Johnson's death. After Cooper headed downhill alone, Zella, McMillan, and Johnson continued up. They moved slowly. They took photographs. They reached the top of the Polish glacier where it meets a ridge that leads to the summit. Okay, I just want to jump out of this briefly. What has happened on the previous day and on this day that is a critical error? What has happened on, first of all, the day they meant to go for the summit and they ended up spending the night, and what also happened the next day? And the answer is they climbed slowly. The slowness is a big reason why they got into such serious trouble. And so they climbed slowly on both days. Remember I said a storm moved by, well, guess what that storm left behind? A lot of snow. Now you've got to climb through that snow. You've got to climb through waist deep snow at high altitude. It's not easy to do. What's missing from this account? Darkness descended again, and the snow on the ridge was waist deep, right? So again, they find themselves, they haven't gotten to the summit and back with daylight to spare because they've been climbing too slowly, spending too much time taking photos, and because of lack of experience, the men took turns breaking the trail 25 steps at a time. The summit in sight, the men later said they turned to find that Johnson was not there. So both of these guys, Zeller and Macmillan, are stomping through this deep snow, and it's getting dark, right? They're basically heading to the summit in the dark. When they look around, Johnson's not there. Again, if this story is true, it does look like human error, doesn't it? You shouldn't be making for the summit in the dark. Okay. We looked and called her name and got no answer, Macmillan recalled in a written account 2 weeks later. Finally, I stumbled across her axe and figured she couldn't be too far. We called some more, and finally a faint little voice said, "My name's Janet Johnson." Now, I don't know whether it's my true crime antenna going up, but why would she say, "My name's Janet Johnson"? Because she's with people that she knows. She doesn't need to identify herself. Now, again, it becomes problematic because obviously down at ground level, it wouldn't make sense to say that. But she's probably delirious, and I don't know if she even recognizes the people that she's with. On the other hand, you could say, is the statement from Macmillan true? Did she say this? Is it true? Is it what she said? He says she was about 100 feet off our trail in the snow, laying there. Now, from this account, basically what is going on is the same thing that happened to Cooper. Johnson is lying in snow, basically like lying in a refrigerator, and that's not, in other words, she's not moving, and she's surrounded by very cold air, and she's lying right against snow and ice. So guess what happens to your body? Your body cools down, your core temperature drops. Then he says, when we got to her, she said, "Don't make me suffer. Just let me lay here and die." And again, you've got to ask, do you think she would really have said that? Why would she say, "Don't make me suffer"? That's another way of saying, don't keep me alive. Don't prolong this, right? Let me lay here and die. And this is where it gets quite interesting. Timmy, I want to put you down, especially if you're going to fart because you're so comfortable. Let me just take away this comment, okay? So Zeller says he roped himself to Johnson, meaning he took a special care to help her. Macmillan said that Zeller took her by the arm. So that's quite a serious inconsistency. Macmillan may also not have known exactly what was happening because bear in mind they're moving through waist deep snow, and he sees two figures that are maybe they're behind him, that are walking close to one another. So does he know? On the other hand, tying a rope to someone else takes a little bit of time. Surely you would have noticed that. Zeller says the three got lost and camped another night together. And so this is another critical mistake, that they spend 2 nights on the mountain. And of course, now it's 2 men with a woman they've never met before together. Macmillan said that he went ahead of the other 2 and spent the night by himself. Now, I find that quite interesting as well, that Macmillan is like, I was not with that woman, right? So Macmillan is basically saying that he left Zeller with Johnson. And so can you see how the group is now splintered completely from 8 to 4, from 4 to 3, and then from 3 to 2 to 1. It's completely splintered. And so you can see that there's really no cohesion whatsoever in this group. No one really gives a crap about anyone else. I don't want to say no one. It looks like Johnson showed a little bit of care towards Cooper, and it looks like Zeller showed a bit of care towards Johnson, right? But Johnson, Zeller, and Macmillan didn't seem to show too much concern for Cooper when he went down by himself. And also Zeller going down by himself after what's, I don't know, it's not the best thing. Anyway, their stories converge again the next morning. Johnson couldn't stand. And her hands were swollen and black. And so that's a sign of frostbite. Macmillan said that they anchored her from 3 different directions so we could hold her standing up and led her past a crevasse. So at this point, Macmillan and Zeller are together with Johnson. Then they reached the snow cave where they had last seen Cooper. Some of the equipment was there, including the flare gun. Macmillan said he shot it. It was 7 a.m. So only at this point, after spending another night at this altitude, have they reached the snow cave. That's how slow they were moving. Okay, so what is the part that is missing from that account? Have you figured it out? Thanks a lot, D. Patterson. So have you figured out what part was left out of this narrative? Yeah, that was a big mistake. Well, the way I'm reading it, now you must remember this story is written by the New York Times writer. Okay, it's written by this guy, Joe Branch. So I'm not trying to say that the witness statements that what he's saying and the witness statements are exactly the same. But one thing that's missing from his story, unless I just missed it, is that there's no mention of them summiting. And if you think about it, that is the point of them being on the mountain. So at the time that Janet Johnson gets into serious trouble is right below the summit. So the question is, did they leave her and reach the summit, and did they take summit photos, and did they do a little merry dance on the summit? And if so, well, then that is kind of nasty, and maybe you should acknowledge that. Or did they go for the summit and then they realized Janet wasn't there and they abandoned their summit attempt? Because if they abandoned their summit attempt to help Janet, well, then that really is commendable. There are a lot of people who don't do that, right? Let me say that again. It's a vital question. Did they summit? This is Zeller and Macmillan, because if they did summit, that would show that they were super ambitious and they weren't thinking about anyone around them. And then they just, when they were on their way back, that's when they saw Johnson. They weren't really looking for her, right? And it could also mean that they intentionally left her behind because they were intent on the summit. They didn't really care, are you with us or not? We're going to the summit. Make your own way. So I haven't been able to find the answer to this question. I haven't looked particularly hard, but I don't know from my reading of this article, I don't see any summit photos from Janet's photos. Let's see. This is the last photo that Janet took. I don't know if that's a summit photo. It doesn't look like I think a summit photo you would be in the photo, right? These are some of the other photos. So you can see they were mighty high up. That looks like it's quite close to the summit, but I've got an idea it was still some way. But that is the element that's missing from Zeller's narrative. Now, I don't know whether the article writer just didn't know it or didn't keep it in, but it does seem to be a very big fragment that's not addressed here. Because you'd think either you would say, okay, at this point I abandoned my attempt for the summit, or I was at the summit at this time and then I went back down. The fact that the summit narrative is missing for me is a little bit odd. Definitely is a little bit odd. It's hard to say whether this is missing from their own narrative, as I say, or whether John Branch, the New York Times writer, forgot to mention it. But it makes sense if they were going to lose touch with Johnson, it would be over the last section. Let me say that again. It makes sense if they were going to lose touch with her, it would be over that section. We just want to get to the summit. Cheryl Locke says, is there anyone still living who was on the expedition? I think there is someone. By the way, that is the Cooper's expedition diary. There's someone, this guy, so I'm not quite sure who this guy is, but I think he's one of the survivors who can still talk about it. Just see what he says.
There are a lot of smart people in Mendoza who think this maybe wasn't an accident.
So this is John Shelton, the college student who was 25 years old at the time. So let's hear what he says.
Maybe there was foul play.
Hogwash. No es que cerró la causa porque contundentemente había sucedido un accidente. No, por falta suficiente de elementos que llevaran a uno o más sospechosos.
This is from the embassy of...
Okay, so that's kind of just giving an idea of different attitudes to it. So the sister who wants to know what happened, who's concerned about her sister who was so experienced, the locals who felt something serious must have happened here, and then you've got Shelton who's saying, on almost like on his deathbed, but basically just from his perspective, he says it's hogwash. The fact that people think it was foul play, he says hogwash.
This maybe wasn't an accident. Maybe there was foul play.
Hogwash. No es...
Right? That's his opinion. Okay, pleasure. Right. So where are we now? If they say they turned around to find that she wasn't there, it's certainly possible, but it seems unlikely given the slow pace they would have been walking. You know, if you're walking slowly and you that high, you are not easily going to lose touch with somebody else because you're moving so slowly. But it certainly doesn't communicate what one would imagine would be a duty of care. So this is what happened next. They shot off a flare from this ice cave. It made a noise as loud as a rifle, but then no one apparently heard it. So I guess you could also say maybe that flare was never shot. Johnson's condition seemed improved, so the men decided that Macmillan should go down alone to get help. Bear in mind, hadn't he gone down earlier alone as well? So he's going to leave the other two and go down by himself, following the route that Cooper presumably took 24 hours earlier. Macmillan said he lost his ice axe in a steep section of the glacier and slid 1,000 feet head first. It would account for the black eye he had later, he said. So Macmillan comes down. Now, even from this graphic, I can't quite tell what we're looking at. There's the summit. Does that mean everyone turned around before the summit? Now, I would personally say, if it's true, and I don't know whether you can prove it, but if it's true that nobody made it to the summit, then I would say that I think that there wasn't foul play. In other words, if I would say someone went to the summit and left someone else behind, then I would say that's foul play of a sort where you are just thinking about yourself. And can you imagine coming back down, someone saying, I can't believe you went to the summit. Couldn't you see I was in distress? You know, and pulling at that person's sleeve. But if someone actually abandoned their own summit attempt because someone was in distress, that's certainly a good story. But is it a true story? And so I think that's what I'm a little bit concerned about is you don't hear them saying, okay, we abandoned the summit at that point. We decided, because you must remember, if you're at that point, if you over there, you are going to be quite heartbroken not to be able to get to the top. And remember, there's nothing binding one climber to another. They've got like no relationships. They've got no role. There's nothing stopping them from being every man for himself. Okay, let's just do that. So he says, Macmillan lost his ice axe in a steep section and he got hurt. And so the question here is, did Macmillan really sustain his injuries from a fall, or did he sustain it in a tussle, in an argument with someone else? He's got a black eye, and I would say I think black eyes are a little bit unusual to get in climbing. Maybe I'm wrong to say that. Typically, climbers have eye protection, so you would tend to not have a black eye. You might have injuries to your fingers, injuries to your knees, injuries to your ankles, injuries to your toes. But like a black eye, you could have snow blindness, but a black eye is a little bit unusual. And I mean, he's saying here that he slid head first. That's how he got the black eye. Well, another way he could have got a black eye is if Cooper punched him in the face. If they were perhaps making fun of Johnson or whatever, picking on Johnson, maybe Cooper hit him in the face. Anyway. Let's go on. So like I said, I'm not sure if black eyes are common injuries for mountain climbers. The eye sacs he lost is also the murder weapon if there was a murder, right? Let me say that again. The eye sacs that he lost is also the murder weapon if there was a murder. Because remember, Johnson has got a injury that's looks like a bullet wound through his chest. And that brings us to the next question, why? Okay, so if there was a murder, now bear in mind, all the way up until this point, we've been seeing that the likelihood that someone could die in this mountain. Like I said, now it's starting to look weird because of inconsistent statements and somewhat strange injuries, right? So why would Macmillan kill Cooper? Why? If Macmillan killed Cooper, Zeller, who's a policeman, is right there. Would he kill someone in front of a policeman? If he knew Johnson was already dead, that could be one reason, right? And Johnson may have been killed because the men didn't like her. So we have to compare these admittedly iffy motives to the broader dynamic that was playing out, which is that the group had been fracturing. They'd slept 2 nights in extreme temperatures. They had extreme exposure to deep snow. They were moving very slowly. All of these are very aggravating factors for getting yourself into trouble. Although at sea level, this is often why murders happen as well. You know, groups fracture, people, groups break apart. On a mountain, a fractured expedition is a recipe for disaster anyway. I'm talking about natural disaster. On a mountain, if a group fractures at extreme altitudes and you don't have a lot of experience, well, the odds are very much against you. Okay, so now we deal with the true crime, the true crimey substance. Are the witness statements accurate? Right? And I would say neither of them are accurate, but does that mean they're lying? Right? So let's have a look at them. So the short answer is no, they're not accurate. The longer answer is one can't apply the same sort of rigorous analysis, statement analysis, that one would in the cubicle of a police station. It's a little bit of a different situation, right? So this is the one statement. Then he saw members of the Argentine army coming to rescue Zeller and Johnson. This is Macmillan's story. So, when he's being interrogated, okay, so at that point, what was happening? So he says, I saw the Argentine army coming to rescue them. I heard people calling my name. I saw dead mules lying over there. I saw a dead soldier lying in the snow. And none of that was real. When he reached camp and he slept, and bear in mind, I've been speaking about sleep deprivation, right? He realized none of that was real. The dead soldier was John Cooper. So can you see how compromised a person can get? On the glacier, Zeller too was having hallucinations, not uncommon in the thin air of high altitudes. So can you really say these guys are lying? These are lying sacks of murderous shit, or that they are just suffering the ordinary consequences of being at high altitude? He recalled visions of construction trucks working near the summit and hearing phantom voices of rescuers who were never there. Janet and I continued coming down till we were through the worst part. Then we took a long spill also. So Zeller's saying him and Janet both fell. Macmillan fell and got a black eye. Zeller says he also fell. But you can tell that they are seriously compromised. They're hallucinating. Well, if you're hallucinating, you're not very good at looking at what's in front of you. It says, again, doing no serious damage, but breaking both of our dark glasses and cutting our faces some. We ended up 3 or 4 city blocks from camp and could see the tents. This is where something very sad happens. Now you've got just 2 people together, Johnson and Zeller, the policeman. He says that they became untethered in the fall. Remember, Macmillan said, no, they were never tied together. Now he says, when they fell, they became untethered. And so he went back up to check on her. And that's when he saw Cooper. I saw John's body about halfway between us and off to the right as we faced uphill. I checked him and he was dead and appeared to be frozen. I didn't see any cuts on his exposed skin and no tears in the clothing. So I assume that he didn't die as a result of fall, but exhaustion and hypothermia. Now, let me just say the following. I don't like the references to cuts when he describes Cooper's injuries. Why is he saying, I don't see cuts? I don't like references to wind when he describes Johnson. He says, Janet seemed to be okay, as I could tell. Janet seemed to be okay, best as I could tell, so we decided that I would go ahead and set up the tent and she would follow as soon as she got her wind. I don't like that reference to wind. He arrived at Camp 3 a couple of hours after Macmillan. The men later said they slept through the night, awoke, and saw no sign of Johnson. So no matter what story you believe or accept, Johnson is abandoned. Johnson is alive. Johnson is being helped and then abandoned. And I guess one can say, is that murder, abandoning a climber, or is what is being told here not the full story? I mean, this reminds me a lot of the huddle on the saddle part of Mount Everest in 1996, where you've got 2 climbers sleeping in a tent when they know a climber's out there in distress. And the one climber's been sleeping and resting for a couple of hours, right? When the other climber gets there. So why doesn't the climber that's been resting go out and help the climber that's not there? So just quickly, this is in some ways a repeat of how they lost Johnson to begin with. They simply didn't notice she wasn't there. Now they do it again. In the scheme of things, this part is the most concerning. One expects climbers, even in distress, to make an effort from the comfort of their tents to climbers they know are facing a life and death emergency, not far away. The thing I think is easy to forget is these climbers are in super sleep deprivation mode. It's not like, I mean, it's almost like they haven't slept for 2 full nights. They're cold, they're compromised, they're hallucinating, they've fallen, they're injured. And, you know, you do feel, but you should be looking after another climber. Why are the climbers not tethered to each other? Why is there so much mechanical injury, especially to their faces and glasses? There's also no mention of what Johnson said to him when he said he would go further down without it. Did she say, yeah, that's great, leave me here? That's 100% right. Sorry, Dad, that's 100% right. Okay, so who are the suspects? Jeepers, I need to finish up here. It's already 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to ruin my sleeping patterns. Okay, so who are the suspects? The suspects are the mountain, right? Who are the other suspects? the mountain is definitely one suspect here. And I personally think, certainly based on what has been said, we don't know if it's reliable, but that Cooper died of exposure by allowing his legs to get, I mean, that to me sounds credible. May not have happened, but it to me sounds credible. So who are the other suspects? Well, the suspects are the two blue-collar crew, the 46-year-old farmer, McMillan, and the 45-year-old officer, Zellner, both from Oregon. And one thing I think we can't get away from is a bit of almost snobbery. Like you can almost imagine that the celebrated celebrities don't come back from the mountain, and the people that are with them are the sort of nobodies of the whole expedition. It's not the doctor, it's not the expedition leader, it's not the lawyer, it's not the psychiatrist. It's the sort of nobody folks are the ones that have got to tell the tale, right? And people can't help thinking, you guys can't be heroes, so you must be the villains. And somebody said here in chat that they look guilty. That's not, I'm afraid that's not a very good reason. And we heard what Shelton said, you know, it's hogwash that there was foul play. And he was there. And I think he was also treated as a suspect at one point. So this is Cooper in the foreground. He died during the whole thing. He may have fallen on his axe. Maybe someone injured him with it. Look how basic these. They're still using A-frame packs. That's Johnson behind him, and then McMillan right at the back. He's the dairy farmer right at the back. And my impression is that McMillan did the least to help anybody. I kind of got the sense that Zeller, the policeman, seemed to help the most. I don't know if you have the same sense. Okay, so we're almost at the end. What went wrong? Heather says, what about the rock on Janet? So there was no group attitude from the start, right? This is not my opinion. This is well known. There was no like team spirit in the beginning, and so there was zero team spirit towards the end. And as a result, you had a predictable unfolding of events, right? Let me just do this. The Americans struggled from the start, right? They started out on January 20th, 1973. I would have been 1 year and 1 day old at that time. They hiked 25 miles to a stone house. That's a freaking long way, right? Imagine doing that on day one, hiking 25 miles. In his diary, Cooper described the stark beauty of the landscape, but he mentioned that Eubank was already sick. So you had the doctor getting sick, so it's pretty bad luck. The next day, the group reached base camp, a treeless, rubbled plot in a wide valley. These days, it's a buzzing village. In 1973, they were the only ones there. So they were in a very isolated situation. They're the only ones really on the mountain. Alfonso had hired Roberto Bustos, a 25-year-old climber, to manage the base camp. Bustos recalled his early impressions of the group. He said, a lot of high-quality gear, but an unsettling dynamic. This was the local guide's feeling about the group. He said the dynamic was unsettling. He said there was no group attitude. He was thinking of himself, oh shit, I'm on my own with these people. Everyone has to take care of himself. In my opinion, they weren't ready for such a strange and big mountain as Aconcagua. I must say I agree with that. The fact that they spent the 2 nights on the mountain the way they did, they definitely weren't ready. Alfonso, despite his experience, was relegated to merely a guide, someone to point the way. And so, in a way, you kind of get the feeling that these Americans, the lawyer, the NASA scientist, kind of took charge in a way where they perhaps should have allowed the guide to give some guidance. Don't you agree? That they should have, maybe with Johnson there as well, maybe she felt she knows what's going on. And maybe even, what's his name, Cooper, the fact that they climbed Kilimanjaro, maybe they thought we can handle this. This is not a big deal. Well, clearly it was a big deal, and they got into serious trouble because they underestimated the mountain. Classic, basically rookie error. Rely on the experienced guide. Don't rely on yourself in an unknown environment. That's what went wrong. If we go to the trek to Camp 2, what happened there? At nearly 8,000 feet, it took 7 hours. Cooper wrote, "Brother, was it bad. Between the ice and Sri and altitude, I was done in." So you're having climbers that are really struggling. The doctor that gets sick, the guide that feels he's not being consulted, the other guy that feels like it's every man for himself. He later wrote about others in the group. Bill Zeller is the real man behind the work, he said of the Oregon State police officer, an expert in fingerprinting. He lugged 80 pounds up to Camp 1. Do we really think that Zeller is an accomplice in a murder or a double murder? Or that Zeller is the perpetrator in a murder? Then after getting back, he made the waterhole, and I'm here in the sack. I guess all do our share of work, but some more than others. Johnson was little help. Cooper wrote, "She's a real loner and appears to be for only one thing, to get herself to the summit at the expense of everyone or on everyone's back." That's not really a ringing endorsement of her. Maybe Johnson decided to climb to the summit by herself, and maybe the two men turned around. The expedition was fracturing from the effects of altitude. 3 Americans, Defoe, the leader, stayed at Camp 1. Camp 1's like right at the bottom. 5 others, including Johnson and Cooper, moved up to Camp 2 with Alfonso. Cooper felt miserable. For 2 cents, I'll go back. It climbed a little bit further, then the misery only deepened. So you've now gotten pretty much the full story. What do you think? So what do you think happened in this case? Human error or foul play? Accident or foul play? What do you think is the true story here? So I've got a little bit more to say. It's believed that to have the highest death rate of any mountain in South America, this is Aconcagua. It's quite a statement to make. It has earned the nickname Mountain of Death because of that. The nickname of this mountain is Mountain of Death. Well, the nickname of K2 is the Savage Mountain. So was it an accident or foul play? It's quite a tough one. Part of the problem is we have a little bit of a limit in terms of the autopsy data. Is it possible the deceased climbers were physically attacked by other climbers? Well, it has happened before. We have seen the Sherpa brawl. Zeller and Macmillan may have resented having to break trail. They had quite a lot that they could have resented. Also being of relatively low status compared to Cooper and Johnson, they may have resented that. Equally, though, it wasn't the responsibility of Zeller or Macmillan to take care of or rescue their teammates. Neither was a leader or deputy leader. If someone was in that position, no one was in that position in terms of the people at the top. So no one felt any responsibility. No one in the group at the top were doctors, where a doctor has a bit of a duty of care. And that is what was required near the top, someone experienced to lead these individuals. So this is my assessment. There's a very high probability the mountain killed these two people. Because it has the highest death rate of any mountain in South America. And I'm not saying that absolutely it's not foul play. I'm saying it seems to be more likely not to be foul play. There certainly are questions and issues. There definitely are some serious problems. There's another picture of the mountain. And that's my spiel. I hope you found this quite interesting. It definitely, when you go into the dynamics, it definitely does make for quite an interesting story, I think. I would just love some clarity on that question. I guess the answer is they didn't reach the summit, but I'd love to hear it from them, how they felt about turning around, who made the decision, etc., etc. Did they take photos? Were their photos examined for a summit photo, all that kind of thing? Okay, so let's have a look at your comments. Stephanie says, happy. Sally says, not breathable atmosphere, which affected limbs and organs. That's absolutely true. Thanks a lot, D. Patterson. Thank you. Christina says it's unsolvable. Do you guys agree? Unsolvable. Thanks a lot, Snow Lion. You got the appropriate name for this topic. Josie says, thanks for being here, everyone. Wow, it's almost 1:30 in the morning. I really need to get to sleep. I'll stay with you guys another 3 minutes or so. It's a pleasure, Brian. Thanks for being here. Thanks a lot, Cheryl. So some of you guys may not know, I've written a bunch of books, and believe it or not, my book's on the Neverest saga. Well, my book on Neverest is by a narrow margin my best-selling book of all of my books. So I kind of feel like, I've spent quite a lot of time running to crime scenes and getting information that has, to some extent, got a bearing on books that I've written. I mean, I visited the Zahau house. I wrote 2 books on that case. I visited a place where Travis Alexander died. I think Lisa Wilson and I wrote about 6 books on that case. Every book ends in the letters ITY, so it's like audacity, authenticity, obscenity, and so on. So vanity is another one. And so the thought has occurred to me, if a book on mountains is outselling all my other books, maybe I need to go to the mountains myself, the mountains that I've written about. and maybe get additional material for the next story, or simply just get a bit more, what's the word, credibility to say that, well, I was in that space. I know what people say, yeah, but you didn't climb to the top of Everest. The idea is to just walk around that area, the Himalayas, not to go vertically, but to go do circuits. So I've been flirting with the idea of traveling to America via the Himalayas, so flying sort of in a westerly direction via Europe, travel to America from an easterly direction via the Himalayas, South Korea, Hawaii, and so on. So I just don't know how expensive that is. I don't know if I can. It's something I'm thinking about doing. I just don't know if I can afford it. But if you guys want to support me on that journey, you're welcome to offer a couple of super chats. I might do another mountain live or whatever. If you guys have got any ideas, we can maybe do that. What I've already got in my mind is there's a documentary, Meru Plus, where these climbers had this extraordinary experience. I might share that with you guys. I would love to climb part of, is it Mount Hood? The one near Seattle. No, that's Rainier. I'd love to climb a little part of that. Such a beautiful mountain. The fourth Neverest book I was planning was, I think it was going to be called Fisher versus Beaucrief. And it was just looking at the dynamic between them. Yeah, I must say, I think by far my best Neverest book is the last one I wrote. And it seems to be a very boring book based on the title, The Sherpas. Of course, it's not only about the Sherpas, but it's almost from the perspective of the Sherpas, looking at all the other clients. And I don't know, I think the Neverest, I think you're talking about the fifth book, because the fourth book is Beaucrief versus Fisher versus Beaucrief. So I do think that's a very, very good book. Is there anyone else here that agrees? A cookbook coming out soon, yeah. Stephanie, what did you think about Neverest 4, the Sherpas? What is your thought? I really need to get to bed. So this is it for those interested. Yeah, I think it's a really good book. So there it is. It's got quite a high rating, 4.4 out of 5. So anyone here wants to read it, it's available on Amazon Kindle and paperback. So I do highly recommend the Kindle version. Yeah. Bear in mind, I wrote more than 100 books, and this is one of the last. So all of the writing talent that I developed, and some might say I didn't develop any, but let's say I did develop some writing talent. A lot is delivered, I think, in this particular narrative. So you could do worse. You could definitely do worse. Someone says, why don't we hear about the Sherpas who've made summits of these mountains? So I don't know how many people know this, but in 2020, I was going to go to the Himalayas and do a hike with the Sherpa that's climbed the most summits. And then COVID happened. So I was originally going to go to America And then I changed my mind and I was going to go to the Himalayas with this Sherpa, and we still emailed a couple of times. And then, so that was the original plan, and then COVID happened. Stephanie's put a link in chat. Thanks a lot. Stephanie says best of the series for sure. John says that area is known for a high level of UFO activity. So someone actually said to me, do you want to do a live on, or do you want to do an analysis on, do aliens exist? And I might actually do that. I have a feeling many of you won't like that analysis, but might be quite interesting for some of you, if you can keep an open mind. Chelsea, have you not read any of the Neverest series? By the way, is Terry still here? Cheryl says, I'd love to hear your analysis on aliens. So for you guys, just a special heads up, I'm going to be doing a somewhat tongue-in-cheek analysis on the John Benet Ramsey case. I'll be saying welcome to True Crime Schlocket Science. And that's an indication that it's a bit of a parody of, like, what I'm saying is kind of a parody of what I really mean. So if you're hearing it here, you know that when you watch it there, that's what I'm trying to do. I shouldn't really have to say it, but some people think that it's all completely not tongue-in-cheek. So anyway, you've heard it from me first. So I will be talking about the neglect narrative from a kind of a slightly sarcastic perspective. So look out for that. Okay, guys. Thanks a lot, mods, for being here. Welcome to all the new members. Thanks so much for the super chats. And Chelsea says, please do a live on aliens. I believe they exist. Okay. So I'll be looking at that maybe towards the end of the week. Laura says, just got home. We'll watch the replay. Happy New Year. Okay, guys, I hope I'm going to be able to sleep after this. But thanks a lot for being here. Well, it's not good to do that. The green screen comes out. Hope you found this enjoyable. If there are any mountain stories you want me to deal with, then let me know. I've got one or two in mind, so maybe you can cover those. If you want to watch this or read this article, here is the link once more. There are a lot of things I didn't show you. There's some photos of them recovering the bodies. I just didn't think it was appropriate to put it up on YouTube, so you can check that out. Terry's working and catching up later. Okay, guys, thanks so much. I'm gonna try and put on the end credits. So I've always got to try and coordinate this. Let's see if I can do it. Cheers, guys. Thanks a lot.